Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today, we have a little roundtable discussion with Korey Van Wyk and Shawn Myszka as we talk about all things movement, skill acquisition, motor learning, in this kind of monster 3-hour episode. Just as a warning, Shawn's phone cut out probably around 2 hours, 15 minutes. So I had to do some patchwork to put the audio together and kind of match it up, which I'm not very good at. So just a warning that will take place around 2 hours, 15 minutes. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get to this fascinating discussion.
Who knew that, like, when I often talk about actually being a bodybuilder back in the day, that actually did happen. So as is proof or evidence in their trophies.
How long did you do that?
Let's see. I competed for 6 years. I probably would consider myself having been a bodybuilder for 8, because before I really took the leap into competing, I wanted to make sure, much as I do with anything else, I didn't let anything slip through the cracks. So I wanted to make sure that I was well equipped and prepared with the first competition I entered. And so I actually sort of started bodybuilding or the competition process when I was in high school yet. And then obviously my first year out of high school and my first year into college, that was when I first did the Mr. Wisconsin. And I guess the rest is history from there. So
that's awesome.
Those actually aren't the Mr. Wisconsin trophies. Those are other ones. But the Mr. Wisconsin trophies are hid away in the closet. We don't really want anyone to see those all that much, because that just creates a whole new can of worms. It gets people asking questions that I don't need to answer.
Oh man, it's just so funny, because it's like, we always think of like strength and conditioning, bodybuilding, strongman, and just like these seemingly related fields, and they're really not. Like, I think, because I was kind of like you. My foray into this field was more the bodybuilding. I used to be really into strongman. I competed for like a very, very short stint in strongman, but like those seem related to athletic performance, and sometimes I feel like they're not. Like,
yeah, oftentimes people, especially my athletes, will ask me how it is that I'm using my experience or experiences as a power lifter first, and then into my bodybuilding career, where I was pretty successful at both of them, of course, and it wasn't something that I was really overly passionate about, as I think we've had a conversation before, oriented around that. For me, the passion came from performance from a movement skill standpoint in athletics. But I just happen to be really good at both of those respective sports. And when I answer that question for my athletes, or for those who ask me how it is that I'm using those experiences, usually it comes down to the drive that I use, the commitment that I use to the craft, as opposed to anything I learned about really my body, or even things from a nutrition standpoint. Obviously, many of the things that we would use, many of the means and methods from a powerlifting, bodybuilding, whether it's in the gym or outside of the gym, and our behaviors aren't things that we would actually tell our athletes to do or how to do it. And so for me, it came down to, I was just more committed, or every single day I attempted to kind of push myself in that challenge zone, or in that challenge point, and push myself further and further in those ways, and I stayed committed to that process. That's the same process I use each day right now to try to understand movement more intimately. And it's the same thing that I approach with my athletes, that close analysis on how I'm approaching the task, or how I'm approaching improvement with that respective athlete. Those are the things that maybe I would take from my powerlifting or bodybuilding career, as opposed to anything in regards to the means and method. Because like you said, it probably couldn't be further away from a physical preparation standpoint for one task versus the other.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I just think back to, my undergrad, and even a lot of my master's work. My master's work was nutrition, but like everything was so hypertrophy driven. It's all about hypertrophy, muscle, and I think we now know that, or even just like just force. Like force is all just thrown into one category. It's all just force. Like getting stronger concentrically equals force into the ground, which equals jumping higher, which equals running faster. And I think now we know that's not necessarily the case. And it's just interesting to see how that's developed and how that's kind of progressed and kind of been challenged to a degree, and how much sometimes I think back to what I used to know, like learn and read and study, and I don't really do that anymore. I'm not so sure that those are the most important things for overall athletic performance, which is what led me to the movement side, because you just, me as an athlete, and Michael, I don't know, maybe your experience was different. Like I was really frustrated as an athlete because I was that prototypical, I fit the mold of being really strong, being big, like my even like strength to body weight ratio was really good. But I could not move worth a crap. Like I couldn't move.
Yeah.
And I was a drill warrior. And then I'd get these other athletes who are way weaker than me in the weight room. There's no way that this other athlete or other athletes should be able to compete with me on the field. But not only were they better than me, they were way better than me.
Yeah.
And from everything that I was being taught, and what I thought I knew about strength and conditioning and physical preparation was telling me that I should be the superior one.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not the case for my entire career. And it definitely is true that the athletes that could move better, and then they added in some of those physical capacity aspects. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were your dudes. Like those were your studs. But very rarely did somebody come in not being able to move well and then went from like backup to starter or riding the bench to playing. It was always almost the other way around now that I think back on it. So
yeah, and I think that's kind of an interesting paradigm shift there for young athletes, because I would fit the same mold of experience. You still to this day, you would be hard pressed to find anyone who was truly stronger than I was, at least pound for pound, when I was 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. And again, like you, I couldn't move worth a damn, and everything that everyone was telling me, well, I kept thinking, well, I better just keep gaining more strength. Well, somewhere along the way there, I kept competing in powerlifting, and I was using that strength or transferring that strength somewhere. But it wasn't where I wanted it to actually transfer to, which was to actual sports. And it's sort of the writing on the wall then for how driven I have become to try and understand movement skill, or what its contributing factors or determining factors towards it really are. But we start to see that, which was something that you mentioned in there, or distinction that you made, where you had individuals who were maybe better movers, and then when they supplemented that movement or that movement skill with that extra physical preparedness, now all of a sudden they became your dudes, like you said. They became the bad dudes, and bad dudes in a good way, obviously. Exactly. And I just kept pounding on the weights, thinking, well, everybody's telling me bigger, faster, stronger comes through actually getting stronger, and bigger will come with that, and faster will come with that. But little did anyone tell me, obviously the skill was still where everything was centered. And it seems so intuitively obvious when we sit here and have this conversation about it. But yet how many of us are guilty of that with our athletes? Of course, that first moment, really that first foray for me with NFL players, I took that same physical preparation centered approach, and look what it got me. Or look what it got my athlete and I. It got him much bigger, much stronger, much faster, all those things. You guys have heard that story before, as if I'm sure the listeners have. But what that didn't get them, or get that guy or me, was more movement skill when and where it counted on in the environment that which he was concerned with performing in, which was on an NFL Sunday. And of course, it depends on many different factors. It's hugely multifactorial there and multidimensional. But on the same token, I think it's more of the rule now that we're seeing that flip side of that, which what we're talking about. You're seeing it across the trends of social media. You guys are having these conversations, whether it's at the 2 conferences that you guys put on, or whether it was at the Sport Movement Skill Conference. We heard more dialogue that was centered around the movement skill first, and then how do we marry strength and conditioning or speed training or anything else into that mix to actually truly enhance movement and movement skill, and using that as our focal point, using that as our lens to view sport performance through.
Right.
What are your thoughts? Obviously, it's kind of the long-term athletic development model is, pretty popular right now. Do you think there are windows of opportunities? That's kind of the term in that LTAD for young kids that aren't maybe playing when they're 8 to 12 or exposed to a variety of different sports. Are there different windows of opportunity where athletes and people can become more adaptable, more in tune movers compared to later in life? They say that same thing like learning language. It's easiest when you're young. It's harder when you get older. Do you find that, Shawn, maybe with some of your NFL or older athletes, that it takes a little bit more or it's harder to really change some of your movement skills compared to if they didn't have that kind of foundation when they're younger?
That's a great question, Michael. Of course, the NFL player becomes such a unique being, a unique organism to study and investigate and then attempt to understand certain concepts on. The one that I don't think we can really do is where your question is sort of centered around, because every NFL player that I meet ends up becoming so adaptable. And because of that adaptability, or because of that compensation ability, we find that as long as they're guided in the right way, that what emerges from that is adaptability. Because I've so often, been quoted as saying, and many others, of course, that the NFL's best are oftentimes just the world's best movement compensators, right? Sometimes they're compensating more positively, other times it's more negatively or more dysfunctional. But at a certain point there, most NFL players are blessed with the innate ability to compensate better than the rest of the human population. So I get sort of a skewed lens then in regards to, the environments and the tasks that I set up and what emerges from that in truly adaptable or functional coordination solutions. Movement solutions that, many times people would look at and be like, well, that guy has played in the NFL for 3 years or something. And then we look at how long he's been playing respective sports. And typically that's an excuse I hear from many in the National Football League saying like, well, that movement skill is really solidified. So there is no need or no ability to kind of chase that dog around its tail or that rabbit down the hole by addressing movement skill, because they're not moldable or plastic, or the movement skills aren't changeable. But I find the exact opposite to be true. I find that every NFL player, because of their compensation ability, ends up getting to become more adaptable as long as they're subjected to the right stimuli and the right stressors within that environment. It really is one of a learning environment, and as long as we place them in there and we manipulate the task constraints or the environment constraints or even the organismic constraints in regards to maybe the instruction or the feedback or how we're hoping that they learn, we find a room for opportunity there, or we find this window of adaptation is there still for an NFL player who might be in the league for a long period of time, and that means he has played sports for a long period of time as well. So I think it's really hard, Michael, for me to be able to use the NFL players as an illustration for that. But I think that every human being at all times is still plastic. It just depends on maybe what their exposure or experience really has been, and then what or how they functionally fit within that learning environment that they exist in. And I think that's where sort of the rote repetition model, of course, has sort of not given us that true idea on what is our athletes are capable of, because if we're just going to keep repeating a certain means of a solution, we never really determine if the athlete is a better problem solver, a more adaptive problem solver. But once we subject someone to that, even maybe someone who isn't that great compensating, doesn't have or possess that great inherent compensating ability, we find that they can become more adaptable at that. If I were to take even our lesser skilled NFL players, or we take the general human being, the general athlete off the street, we're going to find that they will be adaptable. That's one of the great things about human organisms as a whole, right? We're always adapting. We're always plastic. We're always moldable. It's just, the question of how moldable are we, depending on how old we are or what we've been exposed to or what we've experienced. Like, we're all bringing our own unique sort of movement history to the mix of that which what we're doing or trying to solve at that moment. I think it's a fascinating topic, though, and I think it's one that we've just barely begun to scratch the surface on, especially whether it's long-term athletic development or then when I investigate my NFL players and maybe what they did in their movement history to get to that point. You know, I often sit down with my NFL players right away and try to sort of relive their history with them. I talk to them a lot about how they got to that point, so I can try to interject accordingly, or try to use the art of being a sport movement skill specialist into the mix and try to communicate with them certain things that might have led to signposts throughout their movement skill history. Or I can then try to connect with maybe what their experiences might be, you know, and of course every NFL player has such a varied movement experience, and there's going to be some gaps there in regards to how they solve those problems. I just trying to kind of get them to reconnect with that so I can understand how that movement skill emerged as well. I mean, I often, and as you guys both know, and Michael, I know that you sort of use this quote too now, which is wonderful, the quote by Nikolai Bernstein, and I know that Korey had sent me the screenshot, and of course I was just applauding and jumping for joy from your presentation, Michael, where you talked about what Bernstein said. You know, no natural phenomenon can be understood without carefully considering how it emerged. I often use my dialogue around that quote to talk about how they're solving that problem at that moment in time, that one movement experience, that one movement performance. But what the quote can also mean is how that movement skill was constructed and how it emerged over time, and how that movement skill or the intrinsic dynamics of it and that perceptual motor landscape for that individual, how that toolbox has come to be what it is. And we all have such unique histories then in that regard.
Interesting.
Shawn, can you maybe revisit, and this would be good for me personally and Michael probably too, and just the listeners in general, what you mean by compensation?
Sure. You know, we're all always compensating, in my view. You know, we're all trying to find, like, I guess to really answer this question, I want to kind of trace back to something I said at the Sport Movement Skill Conference. And it's an idea that Keith Davids and Eduardo Ruggio and others have sort of shared throughout the years, that when we're acquiring skill, we're not actually acquiring much of anything. What we are gaining is experience and exposure to become more attuned and more adaptable. And that second word there, adaptable, if we're always adapting our skill to the constraints that we're meeting, meaning the problem, at that moment in time, it means technically that we're all always compensating in some way, shape, or form. That's why all compensations are not necessarily dysfunctional. Some are functional, you know, and that's where I know, Korey, you and I often talk or have a conversation, and Michael, you as well, where we talk about this problem and solution meeting one another, sort of this interface, this perceptual motor workspace where the performer meets the environment and the performer's solutions meets the environment's problems. And when it does that, it interfaces and interconnects with one another. In this connection lies the emergent movement solutions. That emergent movement solution is a compensation to that which what we're experiencing or becoming exposed to. And so I view compensations a little differently, and that's why I'm glad that you asked the question here, Korey, because not all compensations are bad, and for most are just truly functional. The dysfunctional ones, to me, there's a number of different layers to dysfunction in compensations, right? Or dysfunctions in skill. Obviously, if it doesn't solve the problem, meaning a guy ends up on his back and he didn't end up in the end zone or getting the first down or whatever that task intention is, that becomes a slightly dysfunctional movement solution. We can look at dysfunction then at the 3 B's of that movement solution as well. Dysfunctional behaviors, meaning the sensory and perceptual information. If we're attuning to the wrong information at the wrong time, it doesn't specify how we have to act. That can be a dysfunctional behavior. And it's still a compensation, but it's dysfunctional now. It didn't lead to the right action because we had the wrong perception, or we didn't gain the right perceptual understanding, if we want to think about it in that way. We could have dysfunctional intentions or dysfunctional brain processes. Maybe we're holding that movement solution in the brain in the wrong way or in the wrong place. And so maybe we're internalizing, and that's where it leads to certain paralysis by analysis, or some of the issues that we find with some of the hypotheses that are out there when we try to maybe reconstruct or deconstruct the movement solution, and we're not holding it in a place where it can just emerge naturally. And we're maybe finding ourselves in a place where, we have reinvestment, or pressure and anxiety or fatigue enters the mix, and it deconstructs that movement solution. And then finally, we can have compensational movement biomechanics, right? And that's the way that typically people define compensation-oriented around, or dysfunction-oriented around, and that's easier to find. But of course, most of the time people are like, movement compensations are occurring here because of what we saw on this respective movement screen, and it means that we have to change those compensations. Well, some of those compensations are really functional. And so whenever we try to attempt to step in and change movement at any one of those 3B's levels, behaviors, brain, or biomechanics, perception, intention, and action, we have to make sure, damn well sure, that we're not changing a movement, part of the movement solution that is leading to greater functionality in the context of the problems that individual faces. So I'm glad that you asked the question, Korey, because again, I know that you sort of set me up on a tee there because it's something you and I have talked about in the past, but I don't think we can really explore that topic enough, because that's what leads us to ideas such as degeneracy or motor abundance and degrees of freedom at each one of those levels or dimensions of that movement solution. Or it also leads us to the whole idea of dexterity as well, or being able to find a movement solution under any situation, in any context, and having a movement solution that's quote-unquote correct. And so great question, Korey. I love sort of where your head's at and where you're going with that.
Yeah, I think there's a negative connotation with the word compensation, that, like you said, that compensation, I think, for many coaches equals bad or wrong. Like you said, compensation is going to be functional and work to the benefit of the athlete, which is something I think the word compensation is always had it connotated with something that's negative or wrong in a sense.
Yeah, I agree completely there. And I think, obviously our friend Rob Gray from Perception Action Podcast talked about this very topic when he really addressed functional movement variability. And of course, that happens to be one of my most favorite topics in the whole world because of that exact reason that you just talked about there, Michael, is I think too often variability, like compensation, can be looked at under this negative connotation or lens, but instead, again, movement variability is often happening because of the inherent variability of the human movement system, as well as the solutions that the human movement system is coming up with, as well as in the inherent variability that exists in sport or in complex problems within sport. So that variability then is, again, just our way of kind of emerging in this compensational way to address the aspects or the nuances and the peculiarities of the problem that exists when the solution meets the problem. And so I think it's just this topic that when we talk about, again, abundance or dexterity and adaptability, compensation or variability within the human movement solution has to be at the forefront of that conversation.
Where's this is the hard question, is that fine line of what's functional variability or compensation and what's non-functional or dysfunctional negative. That was kind of Rob's talk to your conference was, there's a line where there's functional variability, but as a coach, what, deems it as dysfunctional? If the solution didn't match up with the problem, is that kind of the line where it's drawn? If they didn't figure out the problem with the correct solution, then it's a poor variability or dysfunctional variability. I mean, that's, I think, where another thing coaches struggle with is where's that fine line of it's functional, it's working for the athlete, and it's dysfunctional.
Yeah, one wonderful question. Number one, as you're talking there, Michael, it leads me to sort of a theme that I took from the weekend at Sport Movement Skill Conference. And I remember writing several times, like I'd go back in Rich's office. I would go back in his office and quick write down a note. And the theme that kept coming up with is we all talked about movement bandwidth, if you will, or the solution bandwidth, the solution manifold, right? How big that movement solution manifold might be, or how the human movement system is coordinating and controlling and organizing all of its degrees of freedom at each one of those respective levels. Again, each one of those 3B levels, the perception, intention, and action, how it's really organizing that in a way that matches the problem. And something in there that you said of your question sort of rings true with the old Bernstein quote when he said, again, a movement is correct when it perfectly fits a motor problem, just as a key easily opens a lock, right? And it kind of brings up this topic of, well, how do we know if it was correct? You know, I know Bernstein back in Dexterity and its Development, in his book, Dexterity and its Development, he often talked about dexterity, again, the ability to find a movement solution under any problem and under any context and under any situation change. But that movement solution, in order for it to be correct, it had to be resourceful, and it had to be rational, and it had to be optimally timed to meet the problem. And all of a sudden, we start to see some layers to dexterity. We start to see, when we talk about it being resourceful, it means that it's more authentic, it's virtuous. The individual mover has control or ownership of their respective movement solutions. If it's resourceful, that also means, to me at least, that there's abundance in that movement solution, right? It could be tweaked, it could be tuned, it could be changed, so that movement solution could fit if the problem changes, as we know it will. When we talk about a movement solution being rational, that means, to me at least, that there's efficiency in there. There's efficiency of all the working mechanisms that are interjecting or interplaying there, intertwining, to form that integrative movement solution. And if it's efficient, that means we're not wasting time or energy or maybe utilizing working mechanisms of the human movement system in ways that maybe are going to be inefficacious for us to continue to perform that over and over and over again. And then, of course, if it is optimally timed, that involves each one of those 3B levels as well. So for me, again, it's all about matching or fitting the solution to the problem. I don't believe, again, another one of those movement topics that we're going to explore, that you and I always continue to explore in many of our conversations, is I don't think we understand enough or give enough respect to the ever-changing dynamic problems that exist within sport, and what information sort of comes out of that, emerges from that problem. And because we don't understand the problem in deep enough detail or in intimate enough detail, we don't understand the affordances that exist for each one of us. And the reason why I bring up affordances here, Michael, is because when we talk about a movement being correct, it has to be correct for the performer and for the problem as it exists in front of us. Bernstein, if you go through Dexterity and its Development, he's constantly talking about dexterity not being defined in the movements themselves, but in the movement in response to the problem. So Bernstein was one of the first to talk about context. We can't define good movement or optimal movement independent of how it's interacting with the environment and the problems within it. And of course, that speaks near and dear to my heart, of course. But when we talk about a movement being correct, we only know it based on its extratemporaneousness, as Bernstein put it. And that just means in conjunction with the problem. We can only understand it as to how it connects or fits the problem. And of course, that to me is functional movement as well. So we bring up another buzzword of function. or dysfunction or compensation. A dysfunctional movement solution doesn't solve the problem. A functional one does solve the problem. That doesn't mean, though, when we say that there was a functional movement solution, that movement solution or that bandwidth of the solution couldn't be opened up to fit more respective problems. So again, Michael, you bring up a wonderful topic that I saw as a theme of the Sport Movement Skill Conference with each and every presenter, from Carl to Rob to Tyler to Shawn Larkin at night to you the next morning. I continued to sort of hear this resounding message about functional movement variability. But in order for us to communicate what functional movement variability is to the entire world, basically, we have to start being able to define or maybe make it more clear how we define functional versus dysfunctional in the movement solutions. And again, I think that solution is multidimensional. It's not just motor solutions.
Yeah, a couple of things run through my head as you're talking there, and it's interesting. Like with themes from that sport movement conference, one of the themes that I took away was, it seemed like everyone hit on the fact that if we think about sport movement in more of like a classical agility versus change of direction context.
Mm-hmm.
And agility meaning we have to incorporate all of those 3 Bs, not just the biomechanics.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even like the same. They're so different.
Mm-hmm.
They might look the same. There might be some shared patterns of movement, but they're really not the same. And it seems like everyone, even some of the academics in the room, like Tyler, his research was flat out showing that as soon as you have to put decision making in the mix, it's not the same. Like it's not the same skill. It's not the same loads on joints in the body. And to me, that spoke to how you need to learn movement.
Yeah.
Like, even though I might be able to coordinate and put together movement patterns in a closed scenario with no decision making, that doesn't mean I'm going to be able to do it when I have to make decisions. And that those movement patterns will look the same, be the same, feel the same. Just because I can do that in a closed scenario doesn't mean I will be able to do it when I have, degrees of freedom at play. And I really I really take notice when people who maybe have existed on the perfect biomechanics, and this is really what you hit on with the movement efficiency, with like the rational movement.
Mm-hmm.
I think coaches and practitioners who really focus in on perfect movement and clean movement patterns, that's their kind of argument, right? I'm creating efficient movers. And by creating someone who's more efficient, I'm making them a better athlete. So I need all these separate movement patterns, from a shuffle to a crossover to a angled run, to look pretty and efficient and no wasted movement. And by that, I've made a better athlete. Well, I take notice when people who existed on that end start to say things like, like Nick Winkelman had a great quote recently about the fact that movement and coordination all needs context. And like, this is a guy who had lived, and his job was combine prep and the epitome of closed movement for years and years and years. And he's saying stuff like that is saying, no, basically what Bernstein was saying, that you have to take into account the problem and how it emerged. And that provides the context for what the movement is and its correctness and its efficiency. And so I just think stuff like that is really interesting. I think every single person at the conference hit on something like that, where we can't even really consider movement in isolation the same beast as movement in the context of any kind of decision making or any kind of more relevant and representative scenario.
And I think that's the hardest part. That I get feedback from coaches or whatnot, that it's so hard to understand, is that coaches think that doing those closed drills or technical work or biomechanics will at least give the athletes experience to a position or a technique, and that will lead them to be more likely to use that in an open environment. So I think that's the argument they'll get, well, they're never going to use this technique or this movement if they've never experienced it. And so they want to give them some experience in a technique or biomechanical model close, because they think that's going to lead to them being more likely to unlock that movement or use that movement in an open environment. And like you said, academics are saying that that does not occur or happen. And that's where I think coaches are like, well, this is why I do it. They're not going to use it. They're so afraid to put together an environment or open environment and let athletes, maybe some movements emerge from that. They all think that I need to give them that experience, and then they'll use it. And that's where the gap is. That's what I feel.
Or they're scared of things looking not clean.
Yeah.
And they're scared. I mean, it happened, like Michael, it happened in my practical at your conference.
Yeah.
Like it happened really soon. It happened where I had two athletes doing a, one of the scenarios I had constructed. Yeah, they slipped up and they messed up, and I could just the room just kind of like I can just feel the coaches just judging me.
Oh, yeah.
Look at that. He screwed up. He messed up. He fell. He slipped. And I'm like, sweet. All right. I'm challenging their learning. They're at a point right now where they are challenged. And I'm okay with what I saw. And they got better. They got better in the span of whatever 20 minutes. There was clear improvement. And Shawn, I guess I kind of want to get back to the efficiency then.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we are not necessarily going to create efficient movers through the practicing of patterns under a kind of low threat closed environment, I guess then how do we create efficient movers or know what efficiency and kind of you said, no wasted movements or energy that we know is going to be more functional, in a good way?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, they're a wonderful question, because I think it's a viable one that we as a community have to be able to get closer to answering. First of all, I think we need to sort of redefine where that efficiency is truly coming from, or how we're defining or deeming that to be efficient. It's not just in the motor pattern solution, because we can become more efficient at any one of those 3B levels. We can become more efficient with our sensory and perceptual system or skill, right? When I talk about efficiency and when I say no wasted movement, maybe we're talking also about perceptual attunement there to a certain degree, right? The ability to look at the right thing at the right time and appropriately time our visual processes that allow certain movement skills to emerge on the back end. I go back to something that the last time us three got together and had a recorded conversation, and it was after Rob Gray's event, and something that Michael said really has stuck with me, something that I continue to use as an analogy to sort of explain this, is he talked about, Michael, and you can kind of fill in the blanks here if I get it wrong or bastardize it in some way, but you talked about going or advancing to the end of the movie and not seeing all the plot sort of unfolding, the whole storyline unfolding up to the end of the conclusion of that movie, or the reading of a book or whatever it might be. And to me, that's the whole idea with when we investigate and attempt to then understand the emergence of movement solutions. We never decouple them from the problem, just like when we look at movement actions or the efficiency of them, Core, we don't want to decouple it from the perception and the intention that leads to them. And so efficiency to me is efficiency in the entire integrative movement solution, the entire biodynamic structure or task-specific coordinative solution to that respective problem. And so I know that your question was really truly highlighting the motor output side,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
but to me, so many poor, inefficient movers aren't coming because of the inefficiency in the motor pattern. They're inefficient because of their perceptual or decision making. So they're where their perception is, and it's not just, when I say perception, as you guys know, but I want to make sure the listeners are clear, it's not just about the visual system. Of course, using all the sensory systems into the mix there to determine our perceptual attunement to the affordances for action. And so then when I connect to the affordances for action in this way, I'm able to more functionally fit with the problem. And that, to me, speaks back to that of Bernstein's quote, and the efficiency is a piece and a part of that. So efficiency, to me, like, can come from a number of different levels or aspects of how that movement solution is emerging or being organized and being formulated. Most people just want to gravitate towards efficiency being defined in regards to our quads versus our hamstring involvement or something like that, or how efficacious the energy resources are from a physiology standpoint. But again, we can look at that if it's truly a complex adaptive system, which we truly believe it is, then there's a lot of different layers and dimensions to that when we go about defining efficiency. And so I think we have to reframe our lens on what it means to be an efficient mover versus an inefficient one. Because, again, if it's going to be context dependent, that's the only way we can determine if it's efficiency or not, or if the mover is efficient, if that makes any sense. And I think too often then we forget about that whole we perceive and intend and act, and we just think, well, we act. And so, you know, one of the things that I often talk about, Michael, in response to the question that you get as well, that you mentioned there, like, we think if we change their effectivities of having them get exposed and getting them to experience these respective movement positions or these movement actions, again, kind of speaks to what Korey's question is about too. We're separating that and reducing it down to movement action and movement action alone. And we're not looking at it in a true problem and solution fidelity, so that which what is efficient in one context isn't efficient in the other context, if that makes any sense. You know, Korey, I remember you and I talked right before the NFL draft, and or at least in between the NFL Combine and the NFL draft, and we talked about Saquon Barkley, and we looked at his pro agility time, which was in the high 4.2s. But yeah, we looked at him on a football field on a college Saturday and how that may transfer to what he's going to do and the problems that exist on an NFL Sunday. And we talked about all the different dimensions of his movement toolbox and how he's maybe the most dexterous and possessing of the most abundant movement toolbox of any running back in the last decade to enter NFL Sundays. Mm-hmm. It's not coming from his pro agility time because, like you said, those are two separate tasks. They're two separate problems. If we perceive to act and we act to perceive, but there is nothing within a problem to perceive upon, how can we possibly determine if a movement action is efficient or not if it's separated from that, if it's not integrated? And I know I'm sort of continually bringing up the same sort of concepts and topics here, but that to me is where our profession is sort of missing the boat with movement efficiency, or then also, Korey, something you brought up in there in regards to change of direction versus agility. They're two totally separate tasks and problems. I'm not saying we never address those effectivities. I think all three of us have, over the years, and almost probably with every passing day and week and month, we gravitate more towards the agility side, and we gravitate more towards the opening up the movement problem toolbox, if you want to think about it in that way, opening up the manifold of problems that the athlete experiences. So it's not that we're saying that people have to go change all of their activities, but you have to modify it in some way so it looks, feels, acts, and behaves like what the problem will for that athlete in their sport, in my opinion. And that, and only then, can we really truly define if something is efficient, if you really ask me then.
That was incredible. The one thing that I want to repeat, because I think it bears repeating, is we see, say, an inefficient movement, or we see some, like I said, a bad outcome in movement. And this is like kind of taught in schools, and I think we've all went through this. So we look at that movement and we think about the physical side. Well, they don't have the technique or the strength or the mobility or stability. That's why they had that movement error. So it was a poor movement error, but I love what you said. The reality is it was likely they got in that poor movement position or strategy because of a poor perception. And that's any coach, I really don't think many coaches are viewing it like that. They see the outcome and say, well, that's a strength issue. That's a flexibility issue. That's a technique issue. When the reality is they got in that poor position because of what preceded that, the poor perception, the poor eye placement, all those things led to that outcome. And I think that is huge for coaches to try to unravel a little bit, because I think that is where the money's at.
Yeah, obviously you're kind of speaking right to my heart there, Michael, as I'm sure you know you are. Because to me, the key to movement problem solving lies in the attunement to the affordances for action, the personal affordances for action that each one of us possesses. So perceptual attunement to me then is being able to focus accordingly the sensory and perceptual data that is coming in, to be able to focus accordingly to the most specifying informational constraints at the most optimal time to then produce the most optimal action response in a co-adaptive way. And when I say co-adaptive, I mean with the performer interacting with the environment or the solutions that they bring offered to the problem in the way that the problem is behaving. And so for me then, when we really talk about that, I don't believe that we're making the perceptual monsters that we need to. When we really look at the most masterful movers of sport, we're finding that they're finding their way to that perceptual attunement, if you will, for whatever reason, almost by chance. I think Barry Sanders is somebody that all three of us have talked about as sort of as this illustrative example. The Saquon Barkley is another good example. We're finding that because they were placed in this environment frequently enough, they learn how to attune or become sensitive to what the problem is offering them based on the peculiarities of the problem first and foremost. In fact, if we were to take many of Barry Sanders' motor outputs and take it out of the context of the problem that he was solving, and we were going to take some of these sort of movement efficiency Nazis that exist across the profession, they would find him in some novel positions and executing through some very odd patterns that aren't deemed overly efficient. They only looked cute and sexy and nice and neat because it was Barry Sanders executing it, and he finds his way to the task goal at the end of the day, and he ends up in the end zone tossing the ball to the official. And so for me, it all stemmed from his perceptual attunement and the decision-making that flowed from that, and then how he tied his action response in a co-adaptive way to the problem that he was meeting. And to me, again, that speaks to the affordances for action. You guys know I'm all about affordance or information-based control. To study and investigate the information means that we have to try to understand how that individual is perceptually attuning to it, how they're connecting to it, how they have contact with the problem and the environment and the task. And so what you said there, Michael, I think is so key, because I think the more we continue to sort of push the envelope on some of these ideas, we see how important perception and perceptual skill really is to allowing the right movement action to emerge. And when I say right, I mean right for the context of the problem they're facing.
So the next question would be this then. We obviously know that perceptual attunement and skill is vitally important. So a lot of college coaches, high school coaches, you might have, private sector coaches like myself. I can't always 100% give the correct or the optimal perception that they will see in a game. Is it a waste, or is it a waste of time? Say I got a volleyball player and we're doing whatever, some sort of perception that isn't specific to the sport of volleyball. Mm-hmm. Is that worthwhile? I mean, we can. It's one thing, like in an ideal world, we'd all work with, maybe kind of in your setting, more one-on-one. You study the hell out of your athletes. You got only, a lot of our coaches now, we have 200 athletes. We can't give the specifying information 100% of the time. What do we do in that situation? How can we, slim that bandwidth down where we can't give 100%, but is any kind of perceptual decision-making information better than none? Or how can we help that situation out? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it sure does, because it's something that I'm typically challenged with when I speak to larger groups, right? People are like, well, I'd love to be able to do what you do to represent the task or the problem that is going to exist on an NFL Sunday as closely as you attempt to. And the fact of the matter is, Michael, is I'm trying to make generalizations on the perceptual information to begin with. And what I mean by that is I want it to be as representative as it possibly can be at all times, with the true acknowledgement that it's never going to be fully represented. There's no way that I could ever make it fully represented. First off, I didn't play in the National Football League, so when I'm the one presenting the problem, or even if I got another NFL player who's representing the problem for the NFL player that I'm working with at that moment, or that is in that skill attunement and adaptation session, it's kind of this constant give and take to begin with, to realize that we're trying to make tasks more representative, so we have more representative learning occurring, and we can get as much problem and solution fidelity to emerge and flow from that, so we can ultimately gain not only retention of a movement solution that is moldable, adaptable, and changeable, but one will actually transfer. But we must realize, of course, sort of the elephant in the room is that I also don't have 70,000 people that are watching that practice situation. I also don't have 11 guys on the one side and 11 guys on the other. So my problems, the point that I'm trying to make here, Michael, is this, is what we have to do is continue to try to find ways to make the problems, or the problems that we create and the way that we manipulate the constraints around them, to have as much that looks, acts, feels, and behaves like it will in the sport. Because we can never truly replicate it or simulate it. We're just trying to get closer and closer and closer to that simulation. And when we do that, now sometimes people will say, well, you're totally contradicting yourself, because you're talking about having representative tasks, but you're not having a representative learning environment in and of itself, because there's some information there that will become impoverished. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to, at all times, as our friend Rob Gray says, is educate the attention, educate the intention, and educate the calibration of the action, so meaning at all 3B levels there, for the movement solution to find that fit to whatever problem it's facing. So that being said, it kind of brings us back full circle, Michael, to what you said there, is if we can start to get as much perceptual information as we can in our respective environment, I think we're better off rather than worse than trying to water it down and reduce it, as so many people attempt to do. I run into this battle, though, admittingly here, because, of course, again, I'm not built or structured like most of the opponents that my individual NFL players face. So I have to try and determine am I doing more harm than good by going up and representing that guy? If Everson's doing get-offs and doing something in his pass rush, I have to be very careful if I'm going to play left tackle. Because the perceptual attunement and how he connects or becomes or connected to that specifying information will be very, very different for a guy who's 5'7" than a guy who's 6'5" in his opponent, and me being 5'7" and most of his opponents being 6'5", 6'6". It will change some things in regards to the ways that his movement action emerges. But there's no way in hell someone can tell me that it would be better for him to run around a dummy that's stationary and doesn't move and doesn't change the problem at all. And so for me, it's just finding ways to uncover and unlayer that problem enough. And the other side of it was, I say that, Michael, is again, one thing I've said a number of times throughout the course of the last hour has been, we don't understand the nuances and the peculiarities and the range of the problems that athletes have to solve deeply enough already. So if I'm going to say I can't use a problem that looks, acts, and feels and behaves like what it does in sport, but I already don't understand the problem well enough, because I never really truly could because of the true complexity of that which what is sport, then I'm always going to be like sort of behind the eight ball saying, well, I don't understand it well enough yet, or I can't reproduce it or replicate it well enough yet, so I have to wait till I can. I think we never get to that point, and all of a sudden, before you know it, I got to throw that player onto an NFL Sunday, and he's got to behave there. Of course, probably some listeners out there who haven't heard us three communicate together in the past might actually be saying, well, why don't you just throw them into their sport then? Because that's usually the other argument that we get. Like, that's not the physical preparation coach's job to go be the movement skill acquisition coach. But the fact of the matter is we can't have as many exposures or as many as experiences as the athlete needs to have if we just go let them behave in the sport and practice. There might be something really specific that we're looking to help educate them on, whether it's implicit or explicit, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and whether it's something at one of those, whatever level it might be out of the dimensions of the 3 Bs. Again, the education of the attention, the education of the intention, or the calibration of the movement actions that are tied to it. So, again, I don't think we know as much as we need to, and we aren't where we need to be, but I feel like we're doing better than worse by trying to represent as much as we possibly can.
Awesome. I mean, I think that argument you kind of said is the biggest cop-out in my mind. Like, I'm the strength coach. I just get the guys strong, faster. I give a better physical athlete to the coaches. It's their job to do the rest. Like you said, I can't stand that argument. I think it's a huge cop-out. There are definitely ways to bridge that gap between I'm just the strength coach and conditioning, and the sport coach or the position coach is the technical guy. There's so much gray area in the middle that both parties can be doing such a better job on. Sorry for the little rant there, but it's just I hate that. Well, I'm just a strength coach, and so I'm not going to deal with the technical. I don't have the perception. That's not my job. I don't know. I think that's just a huge cop-out.
But from even from if you want to take that approach from just purely physical preparation, as we've mentioned before, and as the research supports, they're not the same. Like, You're not adequately preparing somebody if you never include intention, perception, along with the action. Like, you're not preparing them the same way. You're not preparing them for, like you said, Shawn, what they're going to face on the field or on the court. And so if you just want to take a pure physical prep standpoint, you're still not doing the athlete the best service you could be. And I got this question recently about when I presented about, like you said, Shawn, if we're never truly going to replicate the sport, well, I'm not going to even try. I'm still going to stick to my kind of closed, perfect movement, pretty movement scenarios, and because I can't replicate the sport no matter what. And I guess my thought process with that is, well, then you might be just creating non-adaptable movers and machines, and like these kind of, like, if they can only perform these like repetition movements, of which there's no way we can ever learn all movement in a closed scenario if we're just trying to put movement in these like isolated boxes and repeat them. You might be creating a mechanical, non-adaptable mover versus even just a little bit of variability or perception, action, intention. That's still going to be better. Like you said, Shawn, than not including it. So yeah, I don't buy that argument either.
Yeah, it's the other one, I get, and we could talk, is maybe a sport like a basketball tends to be more popular when you get college professional, or soccer, maybe at the higher levels, that those athletes in those sports are playing that sport all year round. And so, I was just talking to a strength coach a couple weeks ago or something. As a college strength coach, he goes, my guys play basketball 12 months a year. So I'm not going to do agility or movement training with them because they play pickup ball for 2 hours later that night.
Yep.
So I'm not going to address that. And my thing back to it is, well, you can still address the perception and decision-making components. Those can still be addressed in your training, in your warm-ups, in your movement, maybe at a scaled-back version, so it's not quite as physically demanding on the joints and whatnot. But just because they're doing it pickup games or because they play basketball all year round or there's a longer season, those seasons are very, very long. For me, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't now. I'm not going to do movement training. I think there's still benefit to addressing perception. And like you said, Shawn, pickup game, you might only get exposed to certain situations once or twice in that 2-hour setting in your movement practice or agility training. You can take those situations and amplify it, give them a much more repetitions or just exposures to that. So I think there's still benefit. That's another argument I get. I don't know if you guys get it too, but like basketball is the one sport that comes to my mind that my guys are playing all year round. I don't need to do movement training. Their practice, their pickup games, is their agility, is their movement training. I don't need to add more onto that. And I think that's also, I think you can do a lot more specific work as a coach, despite them probably being more exposed to some of those open environments compared to football, which is like a 4-month season and you're off for 8 months.
I love a word that you said in there, Michael, the word amplify, that you can amplify aspects of the problem or certain problems in the range of problems that you know that athlete is weak in. What happens if you know that an athlete is weak solving a respective problem and they go 3 days in their pickup game without actually ever facing that problem or some aspect of the problem. And then when they do, it is too much out of their grip for them to handle it. Like they can't handle it in this more really chaotic, more truly representative way. But if we were to take it and maybe water it down to a 1 versus 1, 1 versus 2, maybe even a 3 versus 3 versus that 5 to 5 when they're playing it in the gym for 2 hours when you're not there, we can amplify aspects of the problem, give them more representative learning because we allow practice then to be the search process where they get to find their solution or a solution that matches to it, and they get to actually attempt to change that process of how they solve it, as opposed to all of a sudden, there it is, pick up ball on Wednesday night, and they don't face it again until the next Wednesday.
Right.
And they get to go then and beat themselves up like, well, I still wasn't able to solve this respective problem or one that was like it because I haven't worked on it. So I think, again, that's a huge cop-out as well. I get people who say that to me in regards to the NFL, like right now. Like my players are at their respective teams, but I'm still seeing most of them 2 times a week. And they're at their teams, and they're doing change of direction, and they're doing agility, and they're doing strength and conditioning. They're also on field with their respective coaches. And people will sometimes accuse me of saying, well, you just want to be able to be this control freak who always has their hand into the mix. That's not it at all. I know that the problems that the individual is facing, the gaps that they have in that problem and solution connection, isn't being addressed at most of these practices. So then I have to do it because that's my role in who they are and what they do and how they do it. And so if I don't do that, even if it means an extra, for some of these guys, it means anywhere from an extra 30 minutes per week where they're just spending time with me, to some of my guys will be with me, 3 or 4 hours a week, depending on what they did at practice on that week. It's extra on top of that, but it's so much more concentrated. And there's so much more direct learning that occurs. When I say direct, I mean specifically oriented around this functional problem they already have a gap in solving. So if no one else is addressing it, well, whose fault is that? It's everybody's fault. Yeah. And if I'm not willing to go there, then I'm doing a disservice and an injustice to the athlete, like you said, Korey.
Yep. I've had the same question. I've questioned myself on this very topic because my soccer teams play year round. Like they're always playing. So they have their fall season. And then when the quote unquote off season arrives, they play indoor soccer league 2 times a week. And then they have spring practice. So the whole year they're playing. And so I've questioned myself on this is do I need to be doing, just like the question you got, Michael, do I need to be doing extra? And I guess to me, this starts to hit at constraint manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, Shawn, you're trying to attack gaps in their toolbox or their solution toolbox, or that there are areas that they struggle with that they just don't see. They don't see it enough. Mm-hmm. And can we as coaches fill in those gaps? And I mean, this is going to vary from situation to situation in what they're actually doing in practice. Like, yes, they might be with their teams, they might be with their coaches, but are they getting exposed to relevant problems that they need to solve in that time? And if they're not, well, who's going to do it? That means it's got to fall on somebody. Like, if that means the performance coach might have to do that and fill in those gaps. And where I've been convicted lately, and this is listening to Rob's podcast, the Perception Action podcast, on his series on constraints, and what the constraints-led approach is it's not intended to be random, right?
Right.
It's not intended to be, if I just manipulate the size of the playing field or the pitch or the court, and then I manipulate number of opponents or players. That's maybe not the constraints-led approach. And so I guess I'm curious as to your thoughts on that, because where I think in some coaches who start to gravitate towards the way that we're thinking, maybe tend to be a little bit more random with their manipulation of constraints, which, I mean, I think can still be good because you're exposing the athlete to a wide range of problems that they have to solve. Mm-hmm. But if you want to be really intentional, like what you're talking about with filling in specific gaps, how do coaches such as myself or Michael do that in a team scenario with 30 to 50 athletes who may not all have the same gaps?
It does make sense, and it's a great question because it's something that came up sort of as a theme on the weekend of Sport Movement Skill Conference, and then several times afterwards as well. And I was probably guilty of creating some of the confusion there, even though, Saturday morning when Michael and I got in front of with the group talking to the Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland group, I know that, Michael, you and I sort of mentioned in there that when we kind of get accused of being this constraints-led practitioner, well, that part we'll embrace. But what we get accused of as being a constraints-led practitioner is this random manipulation. And when I say I was sort of created part of the problem there myself is when we did our hands-on pre-con session, I probably didn't explain enough to the entire group as to what I was doing with those constraints manipulations with you two gentlemen and then Scott Salvaser from Texas Tech, who just so happened to be my quote-unquote NFL athletes for the day, right?
Yes.
And I wish I would have had more time, or at least I wish I would have been more deliberate and intentional about what I was describing about the constraints that I was manipulating. And what I was doing was sort of trying to give all the attendees, all the delegates, an idea on how you can do it when you get more and more and more participants. Now, again, the finger will be pointed at me and say, well, I only had 3 people there. It's not like I've made everyone participate. Number one, that's what I think I might do differently next year, is if I do a hands-on pre-con session like that, I'm going to split up the entire group or anyone who wants to participate as opposed to just taking 3 hand-selected people. So I'm already kind of looking or forecasting how we might be able to change that right off the bat. But, Korey, something that you said in there is interesting because if I'm using the argument that I have to come in and fill in the gaps, which I was, I want to be able to make that problem and solution have more fidelity between the two. I know that I've mentioned that a bit. So meaning we got to have more attunement to more affordances for action. Oftentimes the way that we do that is by having a wider variety. We're casting a bigger net with the problems that the athlete will face. And I love that you mentioned that in your question or in your point, Korey, because when people are just going in and randomly manipulating constraints, sometimes that's where the best learning actually occurs. Because oftentimes people will say, well, I don't understand the sport problems like you do for that respective position. And I'll say, good. What do you see when you watch movement on a football field? Let's say we can take, if you have 30 individuals in that respective group, we can still pair them out into certain dualistic relationships that exist. Korey, for you, if you got your football team, you can take the running backs and pair them with the linebackers. You can pair the wide receivers with the defensive backs. You can pair the defensive line with the offensive line. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, you don't have to fill in the gaps on each respective individual. You're having more problem and solution fidelity emerge because they're facing an opponent that looks, acts, and feels like it will on the respective event as well. So even just starting there at a base level, and then in some way, shape, or form, making each exposure that each individual faces to occur in a repetition without repetition fashion, all of a sudden that has become much more representative of that which what they face in the sport. And so whatever emerges, both in regards to the problem or solution, doesn't have to be highly controlled. You've already manipulated a good amount of constraints, and then if you start to just even add certain constraints such as certain problem and solution KPIs that we know exist, mostly that is in revolving around time and space constraints, right? Spatial and temporal consideration. So if we have offensive and defensive linemen next to each other, well, let's just manipulate the constraints in space according to that which what they're probably going to face. Let's have the offense and the defense go against one another, and all of a sudden it starts to have more representative feel in the first place, as opposed to taking all 30 of those people and just having them do rote repetition pro agility tasks, you know, or 5-10-5s or any shuttle or something like that, you know? Like, all of a sudden we manipulated task intention, and if we manipulated task intention, now we've manipulated what affordances they may see. We also have tied in the spatial and temporal considerations in the size and anthropometric features, as well as physical characteristics of their opponent. And it's pretty damn representative already then. You know, and then to me, that's the true, that's using practice as this search process as well, because they get to have this search process through their perceptual motor landscape when they exist with the solutions that they're meeting the problem with. And that problem will look and feel and act and behave quite a bit like sport will, and quite a bit more than most of the people that I see on these videos that are being posted across the internet and social media. You know, most of the stuff that exists out there isn't overly representative. And when I say it isn't overly representative, it's way on that other end of the spectrum, because everything is being controlled for. So I'd rather have more random constraint manipulation, even if it doesn't really truly fit a constraints-led approach, because there's more exploratory behaviors, there's more search processing that's going. And when I say search processing, I mean the athlete gets to search their movement solution, right, and how to adjust and adapt them to address the problem. So I agree with you completely, Korey, but on the same token or note, I don't want people to feel apprehensive then, sort of having a messier problem then because they don't understand the sport that deeply. Or maybe because like they might have soccer players with basketball players, or football players with rugby players, or whatever the sports may be, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, what I always go back to is the look, act, feel. Mm-hmm. Like, at the end of the day, maybe if you are somewhat more randomly changing the problem, but still, like, as long as you're not doing something crazy, like, don't just do really just weird stuff just for the sake of changing the problem. Like, keep it somewhat relevant and representative by changing the space or the time or number of opponents, or even a simple thing like you had us do at the conference is enter that space that maybe has been marked off in like a tag scenario. The way that someone enters that space totally changes. Yeah, it still looks, acts, and feels like sport. And so in my mind, that's still better than the alternative of not doing that.
I agree completely, because it's so easy to change the task space to feel more like sport, even if you don't really truly understand the positional requirements of each individual within that sport. which I know is sort of a daunting task for most strength and conditioning professionals. So I think some of the things you said in there, Korey, were so vital, because all of that changes the problem at hand, right? Slight adjustments to the initial conditions of what the athlete is facing within that problem changes the solutions that we meet to match that problem. So angles, timing, opponents, speed, how you enter it, maybe what your intention is, where you're attempting to go, how you're going to attempt to go there. It's all emergent then. And that's the whole thing, because sport, the problems and solutions of it are emergent as well.
Yeah, if a coach is at least worried that I just feel like I'm making stuff up on the fly now, that's a much better option than what they're probably previously doing. I think that's what we're going back to. Same thing. Sometimes I feel the same way, Korey, like, because I got 10 athletes from 8 different sports. I can't give them exactly what they feel. And so sometimes I'm just going to I'm making something up right now. Like, just changing the stance. That's fine. Change the angle, change the distance. It may be like you're just making what the next rep's going to be up on the fly, but that's a lot better than, go to cone A, then cone B, then cone, you're just repeating that.
It's still a problem-solving process, and they get exposed to have experience living and breathing in that problem-solving process. And I think that as a whole, if that's what people take from what we are trying to communicate, I think that's such a vital piece of information, because for me, once I started to do that, everything changed at each one of those dimensional levels of the human movement system and the solutions that it has to offer. To make things to include or to always require this to be included of all 3 levels, perception, intention, and action, to always keep them coupled, as Rob would say.
So another question that we can throw out there is, if we're looking at kind of dynamic movement for an athlete in sport, is there ever a bad technique? Ever something
right.
that, like, you look at him and say, that's wrong, that's bad? We talk, and Cam Josh's his thing is like, there's only a couple like biomechanical truths, say, in movement. Like, if you're going to make a cut, your foot's outside your center of mass, just these basic, very only 2 or 3 biomechanical truths. So it comes back to, coaches being married to technique. Is there such thing as a bad technique or wrong technique?
Yeah, again, I believe that we have to look at a few things. I think technique could be bad. Technical execution could be bad if, number one, it isn't pieced into the skill in a way that's able to be solving of the problem that they typically face, or the range of problems that they could potentially face, number one. So it means that it's truly not a functional movement solution, right? Or it can't, sometimes I believe technique can be bad, obviously, if it leads to injury or it leads to pain. So if the individual has pain as they're executing it, then we probably have to look at interjecting in attempting to change the technical aspect, the motor pattern aspect of that respective skill structure. And then finally, if they can't repeat it very well, technique can also be bad. And then they might be in a really, going back to the whole idea that Korey brought up earlier in regards to like efficient motor patterns, a motor pattern that still could be deemed efficient if it is separated from the environment and the problem that it's being used for, could be a bad technique if the individual can't repeat it or can't find it under chaos and it doesn't emerge under pressure and anxiety and the dynamic changing environment and problem. So there's a couple different ways to me that a technique could be bad then, but I think it depends individual to individual. I don't believe that we can actually truly say, like, all individuals, this is going to be bad. There are only certain amount of biomechanical truths, like you said, but we can investigate it. And again, if there's something that is associated or connected to pain, maybe it's or injury, such as knee valgus or something of the nature of sort like that, we must look to that. But before we attempt to address it, we have to see where it exists again in the bandwidth of the technical execution, because there's going to be certain ranges I believe, of that respective, let's call it a technical model. I don't really like those words, as you guys both know. But if we call it this motor pattern, degrees of freedom, being organized in this way, how far can we take that bandwidth of that technique? Because I believe that there's a lot of variance then in that bandwidth, performer to performer, or maybe the same performer performing a similar action, performance to performance, or repetition to repetition. And that, to me, again, brings us back to the idea of defining what movement variability is functional versus that which what is dysfunctional. So if it doesn't fit the motor problem to begin with, or the range of motor problems that the individual must face, then technique could potentially be bad. Also, again, pain and injury, or again, to me, if they can't execute it in context, not only in context of the problem, but in context of where the sport is played. That's one that I see. You know, it kind of goes back to what Korey was talking about with the differences between change of direction and agility. I see these people on YouTube or on Twitter and on other social media accounts, Instagram, and their athletes are performing with what is referred to or looked at as having like perfect motor pattern or technical execution in their change of direction task. And then you watch them perform in sport, and that motor pattern never shows up. And it's like, that motor pattern, even though it was perfect in the context of this change of direction task, or appears to be perfect because of how crisp and nice and neat and cute and efficient it is, it's not efficient for where they need it to be efficient. It's not effective for where they need it to be effective. So even that perfect technique can be bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just to, I kind of want to go back to what Michael said about Cam's kind of maybe like biomechanical truths. So just to, because this is what he talked about in his presentation at the Sport Movement Conference of attractors. Like what are some things that kind of are always going to be true, but I think everyone would agree that there's going to be a high amount of variability within these things, especially dependent on the problem that's faced. So things like basically center of mass to base of support relationship and changing direction laterally in any way. Or where you plant your foot to get yourself to an intended direction. Like where that lands is going to be different, although it will always have to land outside of your base of, or outside of center of mass to get you to go somewhere, right? That will always be true, but what that looks like is going to change all the time. Yeah. And then another one would be basically getting your center of mass behind your base of support in deceleration. So like, yes, those always have to happen, but there's no way we're ever going to teach them how those are going to happen to fit like a never-ending set of problems.
Nor can anybody actually move without those things happening. Like, you can't accelerate. Why do we gotta teach that? Like,
yes.
You can't stop unless they do that. It's physically impossible. Like, so why are we trying to teach something that they'll do on their own? They'll naturally just do. And that's the thing where, like, you know, are you gonna tell them to get lower? Like, why should I tell him or her? Should I tell them to get lower? Is that actually correct for them? Well, you know, the athletes are standing too tall. That was Vernon Gambetti's thing during my hands-on. He's like, you could tell those guys to get lower. I was like, no, I'm not going to tell them to get lower. You know, if that helps them solve the problem, their body, if they keep getting beat, they'll eventually get lower. They will internally learn that. And I'm not going to.
Well, and I think that's
wrong.
Yeah, to me, Michael, that also speaks to the whole art of being a sport movement specialist as well. Because like interjecting or determining when to interject if you think it's something that would potentially create a more optimal movement solution. You know, so maybe nudging them or their movement solution to sort of go through this search process in that way. Sometimes, as we've talked about in the past, I may help them from a guided discovery standpoint and just be like, you know, do you feel as though you could get lower on a movement action like that? Sometimes I'll just ask them a leading question, and I don't even ever have them necessarily go back to repeating it. They almost just internalize it and let their cognitive processes sort of emerge in that as well. I don't want to make them to get paralysis by analysis in that way, or like what you just said there, which I think is gold. You never want to try to interject a technical model on an individual that might not be most adequately equipped for it. And if they already aren't finding their way into that movement solution, maybe there's a reason for that. If we're going to interject at that point, we better be damn well certain we're interjecting again to get value. Like, we know the value that we're going to be able to include by imploring them, or maybe encouraging them to say get lower or get wider or change their stagger or change how their foot is planted. All of those types of things. And again, that would be like being really sort of esoteric out here and saying, I know better than the individual does how the individual has to solve the problem. I don't believe that we're at that point yet, unless, again, they are violating biomechanical truths. But oftentimes the problem and solution, when the problem and solution meet, they're going to show that individual implicitly that that solution is inefficacious. That it's an ineffective solution. Like, they know they failed. They probably aren't going to try to repeat it in the exact same way next time. That has been my experience, and maybe it's just that I work with really hyper-adaptable and always compensating NFL players, but I think that's sort of a rule rather than an exception.
Yeah, that's something that at Korey's conference I said too, like an athlete falls or makes a mistake, like, and as coaches we just always gotta be like, we gotta be coaching. Like, you don't have to tell the guy they screwed up. Like, they know they screwed up, right? Like, hey, you slipped there. What, why'd you slip? Like, they know they slipped. They know that's not good. They're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. Like the riding the bike example. You fell off. That freaking hurt. I scraped my knee up. I'm going to make sure I'm not doing that crap again. Like, we don't.
Yeah, I better balance next time. Yeah, I better not twist the handlebars too quickly.
We feel like we got to interject all the time. Like, nope, this isn't. Like, we got to always be coaching. And then what happens is the coach never shuts up, and the athlete never has an opportunity to kind of like internalize, or calibrate some of their mistakes and corrections for the next round.
Yeah, and to me, that's the whole distinction between being athlete-centered versus being coach-centered. Being athlete-centered kind of gives that athlete an opportunity to be a little bit more reflective about how they want to go about solving the problem. Whether it's in the practice task design, in the organization of the practice tasks, or in instruction and demonstrations and feedback. One thing that I've had to do a lot of, and this probably is going to come as no shock or surprise to either one of you gentlemen, is learn to shut up once in a while, So that's been the biggest challenge for me. Again, all the listeners are probably nodding right now in agreement. But it's okay. I'm used to being poked and prodded in that way or being made fun of. But myself personally, I had to get really cognizant of that, of when I was speaking too much to my athletes about their own problem-solving process. And instead, I wanted them to be autonomous movers, where they had the ability to have the ownership of their movement toolbox and how they met and matched it, or mixed and matched it to meet the respective problems that they were facing. The more, and my athletes like it when I shut up as well. So as any of them who would be listening would be nodding in agreement as well.
Yeah, it's just, Michael, like going back to kind of your, well, why don't you just tell the athlete to get lower scenario? Like, yeah, like could you effectively, so to speak, jump to a faster change if you just explicitly tell them get lower? That was for that specific problem. Like, that same position may not work at this, like, whatever lower position that they might be in. That might not be a good position for another problem to solve. And so, like, as an athlete, I mean, this is personal experience, but I also know athletes like this, and I'm sure you guys do too. Sometimes you can tell they're so concerned of if they're in a good position that they're not attuned to the perceptual information they need to be. And then they're just like again, they're like robotic movers, and they don't adapt very well. So yeah, maybe I could make a really immediate impact by telling that athlete in the moment for that specific problem, hey, maybe you should have been a little lower there. Like try a lower position. but that might not fit another problem that they're going to have to face. So yeah, like there does need to be this aspect of an athlete needs to kind of figure some things out for themselves. And, you know, also going back to the, what if the athlete slips and falls? Like, yeah, as a coach, I definitely want to make sure that they're thinking about that. Like, as they're walking back to the line or to the huddle or whatever, you know, early on in the process especially, I'm probably walking up to the athlete being like, hey, like, what do you think happened there? Like, why do you think you fell? Or why do you think you slipped? Just so like to make sure that, hey, are you thinking about this? Like, are you internally thinking about what might have happened there? But I don't necessarily tell them like, yeah, your base of support was off and all that, your center of mass was too high or too low. But I do need to know, I maybe you guys can chime in here too. Like, as a coach, I do want to know that they're thinking about it. Like, I do want to know that they are in a large group setting where I can't see every single rep maybe, or explicitly coach every single rep. I do want to know that they're thinking about it. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Well, I'll interject with something quickly there, and I definitely want to hear Michael's then, because he, gets experience with this with a wider group or variety of individuals. But something that I try to do, Korey, first and foremost, is I celebrate the mistakes, and I don't celebrate the mistakes so they aim to crave it to make more mistakes. But sometimes that mistake is exactly what we needed in order to nudge them into a better organizational state of solving more problems or deeper problems. And so I think first and foremost, using that mistake for what it is, attaching ourselves to it and allowing them so they can go through the right thought process when they do go through that thought process. That they think to themselves, well, it was, this is what contributed to my poor execution, as opposed to just beating themselves up like, well, Jimmy beat me again. Like, that's not what I want going through their head. So they crave the mistake for what it is so they can make it an adjustable learning process for themselves. Personally, I think it's first and foremost, at least for me. Yep. And I'm speaking there from NFL players, but again, I think it's from it's a norm rather than an exception there, because NFL players are so used to being good at everything that at first, it's sort of the buy-in process to get them and nudge them into the learning point or the challenge point in the challenge zone of their movement solution and how it's being formed.
That's the environment you set as a coach. Like I'm sure you do this too. I know you do this. When people decide they kind of think if they want to work with you, you kind of go through this, hey, this is what it's going to be like. And I did that the same with all of my athletes when we started our the beginning of movement work. It's like, all right, this is the mindset that I want to foster. Like, mistakes, don't view those as necessarily bad, but view them as learning, like opportunities for learning. And when those type things occur, here's some things I want you guys to be thinking about. And then I would obviously remind them throughout, but would you agree that's what you set up as a coach? And I don't mean to cut you off there, but there's resistance there from coaches. It's like they don't want to see people mess up.
Yeah, I agree. So much of what I do is error-centered and focused around how they conceptualize, how they package what they do in this space where they encounter errors. Because, of course, at least for most athletes, we fail more than we succeed, and we're still successful, if that makes sense. Baseball hitters are the best example of that, right? NFL players, Everson is a great example of that. If he sacks one quarterback a game, that's 16 sacks a season, which is sort of rarefied or glorified air, But in 60 of those snaps, all but one of them, you might have failed. You might have gotten stonewalled, but there's a different varying level of how much error you made and what the acceptable bandwidth of that error might be as well. And so before I do work with a guy, Korey, I think that's a great thing to bring up sort of to the listeners there. I want my player to understand where errors fit in our learning process and how we run to them as opposed to run away from them. we gravitate to them. We want to stretch our grip in that way, our optimal grip that we currently possess, so their movement toolbox can get open that much further. So I might have to expose them to different problems or new nuances of those problems that they don't know how to solve quite yet.
Right.
So great point. Great point. Michael, you want to jump in there? I know that we both cut you off, and all of a sudden, 7 minutes later, we were both still talking, and I said I wanted to hear what you had to say.
No, I don't think I have much to add to that other than, it starts by kind of, the culture you create as a coach, before a session starts or before an off season starts by, explain to your athletes that these things are going to happen, and that's perfectly fine. We're not going to look down upon it or anything like that. Is that this is part of the process, and we want those things to happen. I think that obviously that conversation has to take place. I go, back and forth. I think they're athletes, so if they make a mistake, I just hope that they're thinking about it, right? Otherwise, you're going to be probably a pretty crappy athlete if you're really just like, oh, I got beat again. Whoop-de-doo. Probably you're a loser. I hope if an athlete gets beat, they're internalizing it and really reflecting and that kind of thing. So I go back and forth. Do I really need to push the buttons or ask reflective questions? I think there are times certainly you want to, but other times, for me as an athlete, I don't know. For when I made mistakes, I didn't really want to try to explain why I made that mistake or to have to a coach kind of pick deeper. I personally, I just like to kind of stew over it myself rather than be picked at it. It's one of those things that I don't, there's that fine line. Same thing, athlete does something really, really well. Something, makes a super play, and you just hey, what were you thinking there? What was this? Was it that? And all of a sudden now, same thing, you get paralyzed by analysis. The athlete's just
yeah, definitely go the other way.
This thing, I just quickly reacted, and that's what I didn't even think about it. I blacked out in the moment. Are there times where I don't want to really dig any deeper because I don't want them, like I said, the paralysis by analysis of them overthinking the situation, and now they're mind effing themselves because they just can't get out of their own head. That's where I go back and forth. Do I want to dig deeper? Because if I do, maybe I am affecting some of these natural things to occur, or just affecting their natural reflection by interjecting. I don't know.
That's such a great point. Yeah, that's such a great point there too. And I think that's some of the underappreciated ideas of, what Brett Bartholomew would call, conscious coaching to a certain degree, knowing how you're getting your buy-in or when to interject and how to interject. Obviously, that's all part of the art of being a sport movement skill specialist too, especially with how, sort of how sensitive movement skill can be at times, or the work towards it, which I think speaks to what you're talking about there too, Michael, because that's just, knowing your athletes, and there might be times to poke and prod. There maybe times that we got to go down that path, but then there might be other times that we want to avoid it at all costs as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point about the, if they are successful, because that's the other end of the spectrum, right? We've been talking about mistakes, but if someone's successful, we also don't want to overthink that as well, because the less than 5 times I might have done something successful on a football field in my career, it was because I was not overthinking it. Anything that I did well on a football field, or rugby field, which again or rugby pitch, which are very few times. I was just perceive act. It wasn't overthink. I just I can guarantee you I wasn't thinking about my movement patterns.
Yeah.
I was just trying to just kind of get the job done. Get the job done. Get that problem solved. And I needed to be pushed more towards that as an athlete for sure. And obviously, like you said, Shawn, it's the art, because you're going to have someone else who needs to be the other way. Who needs a little bit more maybe refinement and a little bit more introspection in what they're doing. But yeah, you guys are dead on with it. It's an art. It's a balancing act of what is needed in the moment, and that's coaching, right?
Yeah.
I see sometimes a coach break down film. It's they break down every little step of a route or a running back making a cut, and it's so hard from a coach too, because I step back and go, I don't know what they perceive. I don't know what they're thinking. It's so hard to put yourself in the athlete's shoes to really understand all the nuances of why they made that decision. And that's where it's like we can't explicitly try to like say this and that. It's got to be reflective. It's got to be, as a coach, we got to be trying to get in part of that process rather than being outsider trying to tell the insider what to do when we don't actually feel exactly what they're thinking or what the play call is or what the 2 plays previous was, etc. So that's I just want to. Sometimes I think of myself. I got to step back because I don't know exactly what the athlete perceived, saw, felt, etc. in that moment. So it's not my play. I can't. I shouldn't be able. It's not my place to say this was right, this is wrong, without having some interaction with the athlete. So another thought that just popped in the head.
Yeah, and I like that, and it's something that Korey, I know all 3 of us in our little group chat, we were sort of talking about that whole idea of in perceptual motor skill or in perception and action of 2 + 2 always equal 4 or doesn't always equal 4. I think what we're talking about there sort of is how we reframe the problems that the athlete is being presented to them in sport movement. And it's not is 2 here, like here's 2 + 2. It's solve for 4, if that makes sense. Or solve for whatever. That's sort of how movement problems, to me, if we're going to use the analogy, almost has to fit. Because then it could be like, well, you could add 2 + 2 and you could get to this task intention goal of 4. Then another performer might take 8 divided by 2 and get to 4. And another performer might take 3 + 1 or 2 times 2 or, 1 point whatever decimal point plus 3 point whatever, like it's become so abundant, the opportunities or abilities to solve for 4, which is really what the task goal is, or the task intention then is, to determine here's this movement lock. Well, the lock is to solve for 4. The lock isn't what's 2 + 2, if you want to think about it in that way. And I think it sort of speaks to that, which what we're talking about right now as well is every athlete, how they attempt to solve the respective problem that they face in sport is going to be different from performer to performer. Not only the conscious processes that they hold, but how conscious those processes can be and still not negatively impact the movement solution. So a lot of what both of you guys were saying was so dead on in that regard, and that's all part of the art, of course, but I think it's something that we have to be really strategic about and really deliberate about as sport movement skill specialists as well when we're attempting to interject at times. That more often than not, we probably have to say less rather than more and let them go solve it again. And then when we put our analysis hat on, to live and breathe right there with the athlete, Michael, like what you said, to try to understand it deeply, but maybe that doesn't happen through explicit questioning because we don't necessarily want that, and I just kind of think back to some of my NFL players there as well. There was one time that it really jolted me this past season. I was seeing a problem that I thought was something that one of my athletes had been facing all summer, something that I thought that we were trying to address and that he was solving really effectively out in the practice domain. And then it showed itself on an NFL Sunday, and he saw something totally different that I wasn't even viewing when he performed it under real time. And it wasn't only after he went back through my notes, my movement analysis notes, he's like, I don't see what you were looking at all. Like when I was there, I didn't see that guy flash in this way or this guy moving at that angle. And I'm like, well, okay, so obviously I was sort of the pot calling the kettle black there in my own analysis, and I was seeing it from my affordances for action, or maybe what I had seen unfolding as opposed to trying to live where the question is really being asked, which is on the field, or where the problem is really trying to be solved for. So just some rambling there that I thought I would add as I heard both of you guys kind of speaking about that, because I think it's a really fascinating topic and obviously one that we haven't even begun to explore enough.
So retrospectively then, what maybe should you have done in that scenario?
I think probably as opposed to just giving him my analysis, like, it just happened to be a player that I thought should have broken big play. And I should have probably just asked him, what would you have rather done differently there? Or I could have potentially asked him, what were you sensing there? What were you perceiving there? What were you feeling there? What do you think your affordances were? And again, sometimes people accuse me of being like, well, you're trying to arm them with way too much information even with that. But, like, my athletes know the word affordances. Like, they understand what it means, So, like, by me asking what affordances were presented to you there, to that respective athlete, he would tell me what he actually, sensed and perceived about the problem. And he sort of then has this functional contact with what the problem is offering as well. That, for me, if we got to have functional contact from a sensory and perceptual standpoint for them to understand their affordances for action, maybe not explicitly, maybe not in a declarative knowledge way, but enough for them to either A, articulate in some cases, or B, just sort of understand, like, well, I would solve it differently next time because I thought I had a bigger gap than that, which what I did. Or I would have maybe used that, my teammates block in this way, or I would have maybe tried to exploit this player's weakness. Like, I didn't realize it was this player, And then I think we see some trends in that communication, things that us three and Scott Salwasser talked about in front of the whole group at Sport Movement Skill Conference when I was asking you guys sort of these guided discovery or discovery learning questions about how each of you were going to solve that problem that we all saw you trying to solve in front of the whole group. So, you heard different dialogue from three really skilled movement coaches who kind of view it in this way, Korey, don't give me that eyebrow raise. You can't be quite that modest. But you guys are all really skilled movement coaches, 100%, and you all viewed it in different ways. You all viewed the very similar problems. Like, I just kept rotating each of you through it, but it came down to your movement experiences. It came down to your movement toolboxes. It came down to the continuous, constant, circular causality between your perception and your action individually at that moment. Mm-hmm. And no one could see it from the outside looking in.
That was a really unique experience because while obviously we've all three have talked a lot, I've never been externally asked those like leading questions. Mm-hmm. Like, what do you think you could have done? What did you see? What did you feel? Type of questions like you just got done mentioning. And in the moment, I was like, I literally just that was me as an athlete. I didn't know what the heck was going on around me. I was just so like I wasn't perceiving anything. I wasn't attuned to anything, and that's probably why I was a pretty poor mover. And it was just kind of just hit you in the face of just that little bit of leading question. So the next time, I can't remember if I actually got another rep. Someone like kept talking a lot.
Dang you, Michael!
I don't know. I can't remember if I got another rep, but man, I would have approached that next rep or problem totally differently, even if you had put the conditions as the same. Mm-hmm. Like even if you told Scott, start where you exactly started. Korey, you start where you exactly started. I would have still have approached that problem completely differently, and it's even with the same conditions, it's a different problem.
I love that because I think that's a really good point for the listeners too, because it can become repetition without repetition, even if the initial conditions appear to be the same or the problem appears to be the same. What Bernstein showed us back in 66, 67, and before that was the idea of repetition without repetition was that no two problems are ever truly the same. So neither are no two solutions. Right. And that's where I think it's so vital that even if we're just changing small nuances of the information that's present within the problem, it changes the entire scope, the global scope of the problem that needs to be solved. I love that, Korey. And I'm sorry for talking so much.
We'll blame Scott. He's not here.
Yeah, he's not here to defend himself.
As humans, we're always evolving. Therefore, the problem is changing. We're a different organism. We're a different person than we were the previous rep.
I love that.
With the information, same thing from day to day. It's a completely different problem because we're a completely different person on Monday compared to Wednesday. And I think one other thing, Korey, that you kind of said there, that's, I want to make pretty clear about, like, when you're viewing something at a clinic or the people involved in the hands-on session, even if there's like 30 people watching, whatever it is, that was a lot of pressure. Like, and you'll see, like, that was Korey's first rep. And if we look back at it, yeah, Korey's just like, I don't know what I was doing. That's nervousness. That's like, I'm about to go live in front of 100 people. Shit, I don't want to fuck up.
Not to mention my opponent was twice my size.
The young athlete at my clinic, it was a demo guy, a really, really talented, skilled athlete going to play Division I football, falls on his face. Like, I'm like, holy, just because 40 people are watching him. And at your clinic, last week, Korey, the first couple reps, people are like, they can't stop. They're because they're so juiced up to, like, try to impress, that they're just like, they just lose everything. And that just shows some of the constraints that we can put on people, athletes, pressure, anxiety, stress, how it just completely changes everything. And if they never get that exposure, except for Saturday nights on, we're doing ourselves a injustice to our athletes.
Yeah, and there you're seeing obviously certain both physiological as well as psychological factors that quickly end up constraining the movement solutions available to the respective individual. And I think when I pulled you two and Scott to the center right before I was about to present, I think I might have said, well, at bare minimum, or at least I was thinking this, I believe I said it or verbalized it to maybe all three of you, was at bare minimum what you guys were going to get was your own challenge point for your own movement, and really your own challenge point for the concepts of how you own it and understand it as well. Because some of those things are things that you can't coach. Those 100 people that are all almost like, you almost think like they're tweeting at their buddies, being like, Michael Zweifels up there and he just fell, or something like that, and or whatever it might be. There's a certain pressure and anxiety that definitely goes along with that when you're in front of your peers, even if it's not your peers, even if they don't know, they know, like, people on the outside know if you're solving the movement problem or not. Like, they know if you're achieving the task goal, and it's sort of this chaotic beast in and of itself, but it's the nature of it.
Yeah, and I think some of the best movers are the ones that, in those situations, as we all know this, but in those situations, they're the ones that can control, really stay attuned to all the perceptions of their surroundings, while other people just lose it. And so for my team, I try to do things where the whole team's watching more often, because you'll see guys and girls that just, like, literally, like, people, we all see it, like a gamer, they rise to occasion. Oh shit, I got my other 20 teammates watching me, and they love it. And you see other ones that are just like, I don't like this. It's like, well, the reality is sport is watched by people. And it's watched by a lot of people, depending on what level you're at. But it's stressful. You're getting evaluated constantly. That's with NFL Combine, one of the hardest things is, like, not that you get to go out and run a 40 or do a vertical jump. It's like you are getting evaluated by 32 NFL teams intently. Like, that is super stressful. Like, every flaw, everything that you in your movement is just being evaluated. You're like, did they see that? Did they see this? And it's those athletes that can just, like, rise to the occasion, or just like, they just shrug it off and still stay on task and tuned and all that jazz. Those are the ones that are most successful and the best movers in stress and chaos in actual games.
Well, and on that same token, the ones that are affected the most, we see a breakdown in the entire movement solution, right?
Yeah.
That's where it comes down to efficiency versus inefficiency as well. We see at a perceptual, intentional, and action standpoint, we see the whole movement solution break down in different ways. And really what the research shows us is that they start to behave like a lesser mover, a lesser skilled mover. They may perceive or make decisions like their old self, because they don't have the strategies, or the movement solution toolbox hasn't become robust and resilient. Robust enough and then resilient enough to those aspects of the stress, of pressure and anxiety and fatigue and all of those things that come and enter the mix.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have anything else on your agenda today? Anything else you want to talk about, Korey? Any other?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time you got here, but I did have kind of one question written down, or one I actually wrote down based off of the beginning of our conversation, in how we maybe take somebody who comes into us and we're like, oh man, this is not a skilled mover at all. They're not coming into me with a very good movement toolbox, or they can't adapt very well, and how we maybe start that process of creating an adaptable mover. And I guess, Shawn, I have a question for you, and maybe if you're willing, do you have like a story about maybe somebody who came to you, and obviously you don't name names or anything like that, but do you have like maybe a story of someone came to you, a football player or whatever, maybe they're not, were NFL, or maybe they were like a lower level college, or something like that, and they just were not a very adaptable mover. Their toolbox was pretty narrow, or not very not varied, and maybe they're pretty robotic and they weren't a good problem solver. Just like in general, what would be your process, or what was your process for creating a more adaptable athlete?
Well, and I love the question, Korey, but a piece of that, I want to rewind to what I said about NFL players being the world's best compensators. Just because they're the world's best compensators doesn't mean that they have a truly dexterous, a truly abundant movement skill set or toolbox.
And dexterous, you mean adaptability, correct?
Yes.
Adaptability.
So they're going to compensate, but again, dexterity is finding the most optimal movement solution under any condition, under any situation. So just because that NFL player it finds their way into a compensation that allows them to solve enough problems to stay at the NFL level, doesn't necessarily mean to me that they exist on the extreme positive end of dexterity, or that they have abundance in their movement solution, meaning they have what some in the true ecological dynamics literature would call movement degeneracy, or the ability to have a lot of solutions for the same problem. And so I can think of one guy in particular. Again, I definitely won't name names here, but we're talking about a Hall of Fame level type of performer, and somebody who is looked at as being one of those top performers in a respective position that the NFL has ever seen. And when I first started exposing him to problems that had deeper dimensions, that even looked, acted, felt, and behaved like Sunday, he always resorted to sort of this constrained movement solution at first. He would resort to that what his movement strength allowed for. And at first, I encouraged that because I wanted him to feel comfortable, sort of stretching his grip on what he possessed in his movement toolbox. But I knew that it was really constrained. It required him to take a lot more. He has a really physical style about him. And of course, that means that certain reps add up. And I wanted him to open the movement toolbox so it would become more abundant, and he had access to more solutions under similarly behaving problems. Mm-hmm. So instead of, say, meeting a much bigger individual, as his opponent, and always having to run in or through him, I wanted him to be able to cut, change direction, have more than one movement solution to be able to do exactly that, to get by that guy, which was the number 4, if you want to think about it in that way. And the 2 + 2 formula of equals 4, or solving for 4, would have been get by this guy, right? That's our first aspect that is driving our intention. But what is driving our intention is always driving his perception. So what I did, Korey, was I just gradually started nudging that movement solution in ways to allow him, in every task that we perform, to kind of go through this search process. But I did it by layering in dimensions of perceptual and cognitive decision-making. So perceptual attunement and decision-making. I brought that into the mix with everything. And then I would encourage him to make a different decision as opposed to what he did maybe the previous time. So I just kind of set up a problem that would behave similarly enough at first because he knew he had solutions to them. And we're talking about a guy who, again, because of sort of the movement history that he was coming and entering our space with, he didn't want to maybe fail right away. I needed to have that buy-in to say, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to explore your movement toolbox a little bit more because I think there's more in there. Right. And so what I would do is have a problem that would change ever so slightly. Some nuance of the problem, whether it was, what our space and time relationship between him and the opponent, who just happened to be me, behaving like a linebacker in space there. Maybe I was changing, then I would adding a little bit of complexity in the problem, so I would change the rep ever so slightly to maybe change more speed that I was moving at, maybe the position that I was coming into, maybe the angle that I was running at, or maybe where he needed to go after cutting or changing direction. And of course, because of his former really physical style of moving in order to solve for 4 in that way, all of a sudden he started to realize that he had more solutions in his toolbox that I got him to, because, in a practice setting, he didn't want to take those hits and I didn't want to take those hits from him. We weren't doing that. I was like, let's have you go explore ways for you to change direction or become agile. And that is your functional fit to this problem right here in this search process. And so the way that I did it, and the way that almost anyone can do it, is just simply change the complexity of the problem or the actual nuances of the problem. So the performer then always has to make a decision, number one. Number two, they have to be able to time their actions accordingly. And because they have to time their actions accordingly, you have them get more perceptually attuned because they have to connect their actions to the perception. And so I started putting more ownership on him to perceive, intend, and act, for himself, as opposed to just saying, well, I see this problem again and again. I've had exposure and experience and even effectiveness running through this guy, but knowing full well that, to play a long time in the NFL, we're trying to avoid some of those things, number one. Number two, once you only have one solution, performers across the league, your opponents across the league, can quickly come to a solution that matches your problem as well, if that makes sense. So I had to open up his toolbox in that way, even though he was really effective when he got to me. We're talking about a guy who'd been an all-pro prior to that point. And that was my way of sort of communicating to him that he had to open his toolbox, but also to really have him explore that and to be comfortable sort of finding his way through that search process as well. So hopefully that made some sense there, because I think there might be some things that everyone can take from that, not just myself with the NFL player in that regard.
So were there times where you said you may not use this type of movement, where you
I would have to in certain ways. What I try to do more often than not is have, as we've talked about throughout the last 2 hours, is have the problem expose the gap in the movement skill set. But I remember that I had to prove to him that he didn't have that in his skill set. So I went back and looked through, we're talking again about an all-pro, and when he got to me, if I remember correctly, he had already had 5 or 6 seasons in the NFL. And I went back and showed him how he continually found himself in a really restricted or constrained movement solution under problems that behaved like that one that I was suggesting. So I had him at least explicitly connect or consciously connect to the fact that, okay, maybe I am really constrained with this coordinative solution. And that there might, in order for my whole skill set, my intrinsic dynamics to become more well-rounded, I have to explore aspects and nuances of that solution skill set. And so I sort of had him buying into that initially. And then what I would do is, as soon as he started to find some success, is I would change the problem again. And so I would see how he would adapt. So I was constantly forcing him to lose grip of his solution toolbox in a problem that was continually sort of unfolding with more layers and more. I'm back, I think. The danger of using your phone as opposed to your computer, as you're accustomed to.
I think your phone's like, I've had enough of this crap.
You said attunement and affordances and effectivities and perception and action way too much, I think is what it was telling me.
I think it's a good topic. What we were talking about, Korey, what you just kind of mentioned there.
Yeah, just with like, I guess my crux of the question is just, as a coach, I would always like to think that, specifically strength and conditioning. Like, I know that making all my athletes better physically. Like, I know their physical capacity is getting better. And every strength coach will do that. Like, no strength coach on the face of the planet will not do that.
It's easy because you can quantify it,
and it's overall just easy. I mean, making people stronger.
Easy.
Especially the strength levels they would need for sport. I mean, it's not rocket science. Now, if you're talking like Shawn, like your past as a power lifter, bodybuilding, you're trying to eke out every single pound or every single maximize hypertrophy to the single digit %. That's different. But like for athletic performance and strength, I think we'd all agree here that it's beneficial for them to be stronger, but they don't need to be elite level power lifter stronger. But from a movement standpoint, I guess as a coach, like I want to know that because at our level, at my level, I guess specifically, but really all levels, you have even D1. And if people have ever been at Division I, they don't really realize this, but they get a lot of athletes who aren't amazing athletes. They're just not. Like, I have kids on my teams, and I played with athletes who could have played Division I. I have no doubt about it. So even at D1 levels, you're not getting these freak athletes. All like there are obviously some of them, but as a coach, I would just wanted to know like your thoughts on how do you take these like C-level athletes from a movement qualification standpoint, bring them to a B or a B to an A level, and so then you're like raising really the talent level of your whole team from a movement qualification standpoint and better movers. And I think that we all agree that all the stuff we've talked about helps. Like off air, kind of while you were off, Michael and I were just like, well, the alternative just is not going to get the job done. Meaning no, like very little problem solving, closed movement, rote repetition is not going to get the job done. But like, what are some maybe things we can do? And I know we've talked about it a lot already, but my motivation with the question was taking people who don't have a very broad movement toolbox or varied movement toolbox and creating more of a movement toolbox.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, like you said, I think the easiest way to do that is require them to perceive and intend, and to tie that in a cyclical sort of circular causality fashion, because then it does take C-level athletes and boom for them and bump them into the B level or maybe even higher, because you're going to make individuals who are much more comfortable being uncomfortable with constant, ever-changing, maybe even novel situations or circumstances. You're going to give them sort of that adaptability factor that is lacking at athletes at all levels. Not the Division III, not exclusive to the Division I. It's everywhere. High school, NFL, everything in between, every professional organization. Because of the nature of most of our practice methods and the implication of many of our previously held theories and ideas of perfect practice and some of the things that go along with that, adaptable movers is the exception. And because adaptable movers are the exception, if you can do it with more of your athletes become the exception to the rules that currently exist. And I truly wholeheartedly believe that whether you're working with NFL players or whether you're at Northwestern or whether you're wherever it is that you are and whoever it is that you work with and whatever level that they behave at. And I think that's sort of this common denominator is athletes who can perceive and intend and act are sort of the special rare breed. But I don't believe that that has to be the case. I believe that we should be able to get everybody in that place and in that way. It's still going to be nonlinear, so not everyone is going to make the same adjustments or have the same line of progress, right, or maybe have the same room for potential of adaptation, but we can make every mover more adaptable. I truly wholeheartedly believe that. I don't believe that there's ever been a fully dexterous individual. One of the things I've been doing in recent weeks has been studying some of the most masterful movers in the National Football League and those most masterful movers that the NFL has ever seen. Even using a guy like a Barry Sanders, who obviously I use as an illustrative example in many cases, and finding the gaps that I believe exist within his movement toolbox. And that's been a really worthwhile experience for me to do that, because I see what I would have tried to do, at least at first, what I would try to do and what I would have tried to explore and help for his search process if we would have rewound 20 years and I would be in his corner as his movement skill acquisition coach. Like, what would I have done with Barry Sanders based on the strengths and weaknesses in his movement history and his movement, exposure and the way that he currently solved problems? I think we could do it with everyone.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I would go, and I think that's why the room for potential is so much bigger than it is for some of those more traditional implications for performance coaches, such as strength or speed, or change of direction capability or flexibility or any of those things, right? Or work capacity, any of those general motor abilities that we're typically entrusted with increasing. Our room for transference is that much bigger because our room for potential is that much bigger.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I mean, I guess some thoughts from my point on that question, Korey. I think there is, as kind of Shawn said, there is a place for you need repetitions, and not repetition after repetition, but you need as much exposure and repetitions to perception and action as possible. And so that's where I've tried to, is anywhere I can do it, anywhere it's possible, I try to include a perception. Mm-hmm. And that's our warm-up. Instead of just doing A skips or just a shuffle step or a general warm-up, can we throw in a perception there? Or can we throw in a decision-making component anywhere as much as possible? I think that's what I've been thinking about, just because you need repetitions. At the end of the day, no matter what it is, the repetitions do matter. And so can we throw in decision-making perception everywhere possible? The second thing that I would say in a college setting, in a high school setting, professional setting would be, can we get the coaching staff on board and make the practices practice better? Can we make the practices more representative? Can we make individual period not a waste of time? Can we do things in practice that fit some of these principles of motor learning and skill acquisition and make better movers? I think, from my standpoint, I think those are two of the most powerful ways to do it. But that's my thoughts right now. I don't know what you guys think.
I love both of those. I love both of those too. Obviously I'm sitting here nodding my head just because I think there's so much truth to what you said there, and there's so much potential for power and impact as well. Just to communicate more with coaches so they can understand sport movement behavior, both in regards to motor control and how it emerges, but also motor learning and movement skill acquisition and how that may emerge, to get sport coaches sort of speaking the same language and viewing what's happening from a performance standpoint under this lens can be so powerful and so impactful immediately, because practices that are being utilized out there are more of the rote repetition model, and they're sort of conveying the wrong messages at times, or at least what I believe to be true for the right versus the wrong ways to acquire skill at this point. They're doing so many, or they're violating so many of those motor learning principles. And I think that was one of, your session, Michael, that you had at Sport Movement Skill Conference, the very first session on Saturday morning, as you showed people directly how some of those motor learning principles look and how they can then just unfold in the practice environment and practice setting. I mean, both of you guys are exemplars as far as how to do that. But I think the more we can continue to get all of our coaches, sport coaches included, on board with that, the more impactful it really can be.
And that's what kind of Tyler talked about at your conference. And
yeah,
your volleyball coach came to the movement conference, I think, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. But Tyler, when he ended his presentation, was like, I got a call, I think he said last night, from our volleyball coach. And mm-hmm. He's on board. How do we use a constraints-led approach to practice? Like, here's a sports scientist getting a call from the head sports coach. How can we make our practices better? Like, I think that's huge in our process to make a C mover to a B minus mover to a B mover and everything along that scale. I think that's where a lot of the power lies, because there's a lot of time spent with the sport coaches in practice, and there's a lot of repetitions and a lot of opportunities there to be gained if they can get on board and we at least tweak a couple components of practice to make them, just a better learning environment.
Yeah, I love that. And I dream of the day that happens in high-level American football, where the football coaches are reaching out to individuals who maybe have a little bit more intimate knowledge in regards to how movement is being controlled in sport and how to shape that emergent movement. I think it's only a matter of time till more people start seeing the light in those ways. At least that's what I hope and pray and believe each and every day. Because that sport and the entire landscape of it, as well as the practice for it, will change for the better. I wholeheartedly believe that.
Shawn, how do you determine how much practice one of your players needs?
Oh, good question. Of course, it depends on a whole lot of factors. As one could probably, that's the easy answer, of course. Like, it depends individual by individual. Especially because, at least in my respective setting, some players get a lot more reps than others do, and then some players get much more representative reps than others do as well.
Right,
so let's say I have a scout team player who's trying to perform or behave like someone else, or maybe, they're kind of getting beat up on because they're a third teamer or something like that, and they don't get as many reps that are truly representative of where their movement skill gaps are or something of that nature. It really is highly variable, simply because of how varied the experience and exposure is for each one of my players every week. The way that I go about determining it, though, is those things coming into the mix, but also things such as maybe qualitatively how much change I believe we're aiming to make at that moment in time as well. So if that individual maybe doesn't get a lot of playing time, that might be a really good opportunity for me to spend more time with them. Yeah. Versus maybe it's a guy who has 60, 65 snaps. Any time that I spend with him has to be of the most highly quality of nature, of course, and it ain't so much about getting more reps, but it's about getting the right types of reps that he can behave accordingly to make a direct change to a Sunday, or to, where the skill may be at that moment and how much we're trying to change it. So, obviously it's sort of a messy congruence of factors there that enter the mix for each player. But definitely a worthy question to try and have to answer.
Again, my motivation for the question is because I got that question at Michael's conference.
Okay.
I asked how much time I get to work on movement with my athletes, and I said, and this is specifically football, but it's pretty true for all athletes. It's we got about 40 minutes a week total. And so they're like, well, can you actually make anybody better in only 40 minutes a week? And I'm like, that's a good question. I do think that, or else I wouldn't do it. I mean, and I'm not trying to be a jerk with that answer, but like, I think I could make someone better in 20 minutes. And this is like, think of it as 2 20-minute sessions.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that just, that really is like kind of it kind of is a win for more of what we're talking about. If I only have 20 minutes, what I'm going to spend it putting athletes in scenarios where they got to solve problems and use movement to solve problems. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes doing rote repetition after repetition. We're going to build a scenario and we're going to go rep without rep and just tweak things to change the problem every time. And in that 20 minutes, it's a very rich 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Very rich 20 minutes. And I mean, you both have seen all of my videos, and I think there's no doubt they get better. Even just in talking with athletes in their spring practices, that's the feedback you get. That's the ultimate feedback, right? That's like, how are you performing on the field in practice? And it's fun to hear them talk. It's fun to hear them talk about things they weren't able to do before. Like, oh my, I had this specific situation, and I did this, and I was like, oh man, I never used to be able to do that, or I have never done that before. And that's kind of like why I was talking, like, was my motivation for the question was, here I am 40 minutes a week with this type of work. And I think even with that minimal work, it sounds minimal, but they're getting better, and
Absolutely. And to kind of reiterate your point, Korey, you're hands-on at my conference, and I think I felt it at Shawn's. It was 15, 20 minutes with our athletes, and they got better.
Yeah.
You can in 20 minutes, you can see people's movement behaviors, or how they approach things, where their eyes are at, improve.
Adjustments they made.
Like, so you say 20 minutes, you can really make improvement. You watch the session 20 minutes, buddy. You watched it last hour. You saw two young athletes in 20 minutes, dynamic change. Pretty good athletes. Like, yes, 20 minutes makes a change. Is it ideal? No. But, yeah, you can definitely make improvements with 2 20-minute sessions. You saw it firsthand there in the actual hands-on portion. 2 kids get better. Yes, you can. I mean, but, yeah, is it ideal enough time? Yeah, you'd agree. No, it's not.
Yeah, I think there's something really key in there. Obviously, that the dynamic side of ecological dynamics would state that the human movement system is a complex adaptive system, right? And so if we allow that complex adaptive system to self-organize by connecting to the ecological side, which is the information that's present in the problems that they face, it doesn't take a lot to get those component parts of that adaptive system, of that complex system, to self-organize differently, to adapt differently, to do it more efficaciously if it's exposed to the right problems. And so that's really, what I'm hearing being said by both of you guys. And obviously, I would agree, Michael, obviously, with your session, you've had people hands-on. I think, you had 20 to 25 minutes where you explained some lecture stuff, and then you had 20, 25 minutes where you had performers actually showing their movement skills in the problems that you were setting up. And I watched the video back, and you saw them changing nuances and aspects of their process of execution. That's in 20 minutes. And it can happen. I think it was the last time that us three talked on a podcast interview, Michael, you brought up the changes in Indo period in American football, specifically in NFL. And that's the recommendation that I typically give to NFL coaches right off the bat, is they're like, well, we don't have time for a movement coach to be telling us exactly how each performer should move. Like, that's fine. But what you have to do is understand how that movement skill should be forged and how it's emerging. So you change your 10 to 15 minutes Indo time every single day, and you'd be surprised at what would happen across every NFL roster if every NFL roster did that. Shoot, if just one NFL roster did that, I can't wait to see what happens. Just selfishly there.
But that adds up so much. Like, every day, 15 minutes, and you're working on relevant problems and solutions and working through them. I mean, that's a game changer.
I agree. Yeah. Obviously, you're preaching to the choir with us too. So hopefully there's people still listening at this point that would agree and then be willing to be part of that change as well.
But yeah, that's where I try to steal, 5-10 minutes from the warm up, from aspects of the weight room. Can we somehow find another 5-10 minutes daily where we can include some of these things? Because like you said, they add up. At 4 days a week, 45 weeks a year, those things add up to a lot of time, a lot of repetitions. And the biggest thing I see is like, the more you preach it, the more you emphasize it, the more athletes know of its importance. And then I get high school kids that are like, they know, they're very in tune, and they know it's important to perceive. It's important to know where my eyes are at. It's important. All those things they know is very, very held in high importance. Just because in our warm up from start, the first thing we talk about is where your eyes at. Are you perceiving? Are you acting? Are you? If your offense, are you being deceptible? Are you changing tempo?
Yeah.
Now they start to realize this is important. Like,
are you experimenting?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Are you creating? Yeah.
So, what the athletes will get away what they'll take away what you emphasize. So if you emphasize that, they're gonna learn.
Sorry for continually looking off. I'm trying to keep my my two little terriers here from going ape shit at any point. They've been so patient that I keep reaching off here because I know they both see the squirrels outside of my window right here, and they're just looking at me like, get off the phone so I can bark at these squirrels. But they're being so patient that I keep reaching off to pet them. To give them reassurance that they're doing the right thing.
We thought we lost you again. Your screen blacked just for a second, so we thought we lost
you again.
You guys could only be so lucky.
Last question for everybody. So the other question I think we probably all get a little bit, and Tyler's presentation at your clinic, Shawn, touched certain aspects of this. Is this: how do you control then for the load and the volume, right? How is there a progression to agility when you don't have 100% control on the tissue loading or the general volume of your agility session compared to change direction? We did 5 reps of 5-10-5s, so everyone's concerned about progressions and progressing load and getting the athletes appropriate volume. That's again progressing over time. Agility is a little bit more difficult to have those loads and volumes in place. I'm sure you guys have gotten this question, but thoughts on that?
I think first and foremost, one interesting sort of niche that has emerged here in 2016, 2017, and now in 2018, and hopefully beyond, will be some of the research in regards to skill acquisition periodization. Damian Farrell, Robertson, and some others have started to sort of explore this topic and unlayer it a bit. Just as we periodize, physical preparation means and methods, I believe we have to periodize skill acquisition means and methods. And what I mean by that is not always overloading, even though all three of us are definitely in the bandwagon where we're looking to keep a constantly dynamic problem, a complex problem, and adding as much complexity and layering to the problem that exists in front of the individual. I think part of the loading that will come there will be the perceptual and cognitive load will start to change the physical or biomechanical load as well. And so even if we can't quantify it, even if we can't be overly objective with how we're quantifying that load, I think we have to be qualitative and subjective in that regard and not always exist in that place or in that space where we're pushing individuals perceptually and cognitively, as well as biomechanically then as well. So that for me is an interesting topic, but I think we can have sort of this high, low, or medium type of problem that needs to be solved, and it all depends on how complex that problem that needs to be solved that is presented to the individual is for each respective performer. And of course, that's some of the art of the nonlinear pedagogy as well, of being able to figure out how you mix and match that in sort of the time scales of learning and movement skill acquisition that are going to emerge from that as well, that we got to give the behaviors in the brain some time to adapt and adjust as well, So we're not just always overloading it, but instead we can give it a chance to attune and adapt.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that question, and I actually don't think I've ever gotten that question, because everyone's always like, for me, they're like, are you even doing enough? That's always the question I get. And from a load standpoint, I'm not concerned about it, because it is such a short amount of time. I think skill acquisition periodization is fascinating. And, Rob Gray has talked about this. I've heard him talk about it several times. And what's super interesting about what he says, it's almost the exact opposite of what we're taught here in a physical preparation standpoint, about everything's got has to start very controlled and low variability, and you progressively work towards more reactive or quote unquote open scenarios. And that coincides with when you're getting ready for competition. So in the winter, most like the very early off season, most physical prep coaches are taught no reactive stuff, work on movement quality, or learning good movement practices, or clean movement. And then you're not introducing really any reaction or variability until you're close to competition. Mm-hmm. And what Rob has kind of said with the skill acquisition periodization is, he almost flips that, almost exactly flips it, where maybe very, very early on where GPP is a factor and they're not prepared in any general way, maybe you're not quite throwing them or not adding variability or degrees of freedom, although we would all agree there's ways you can get around that. And just because you're not adding a lot of variability doesn't mean there's not perception and action. But then as soon as you feel like more comfortable as a coach, or you feel ready as an athlete, that kind of off-season time might need to be the messiest, or should be the messiest time. And then as you get closer to the season, you're building confidence. And maybe you're giving them problems or that they can solve a little bit more, I don't know, quote unquote, easily. Obviously, this is very nonlinear. So, and we've talked about the difference in people day to day, but I just think it's fascinating where he's talking about the messiest time of year might need to be that kind of early off-season time where it's mistake-filled and there's learning, and it's more about motor learning and not motor performance.
Yeah.
From a classical physical prep standpoint, we're taught the opposite, where don't make it messy until the end, where it's you're butted up against the season. And this is, again, just from what Rob is saying, from the skill acquisition periodization, maybe it needs to be the other way around. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something on a couple of different points there, specifically with that flipping of the script, number one. The other side of it is, something that I know all three of us constantly talk about is sort of understanding what the goal and objective at that moment of time is. Is it motor learning, or is it movement performance, or motor performance or motor learning, in that distinction of it, because that goal for that session or of that activity is going to make major difference or major headway on which one we're going closer to. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you're saying there, a lot of times coaches are guilty of thinking they're two in the same, that if someone is performing well, they must be learning, obviously, because that's some of our traditionally held implications of many of our traditionally held theories. But I think first and foremost, the question every coach has to ask themselves is, at this time of the year, should we be addressing aspects of movement skill acquisition and motor learning, or should we be trying to peak, if you want to think about it in that way, motor performance or motor execution? But I'm with you, Korey. I think you hit on a couple different points there as well that I think are sort of money topics that I'm really imploring everyone to sort of investigate in their own head on how they view that, because it will change our program design and our practice environment considerably.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Anything else? Yeah, I mean, My wife's just looking at me a little funny, ready for dinner. Like 3 hours.
She should have known. Yeah, she should have known after that night in Arizona, right?
Yeah.
that sounds really bad when I say it like that without having met your wife. But she should have known from that time.
Yeah, I warned Jen. I'm like, my Jen. I'm like, just so you know, don't expect to see me before like 6.
And I tried to warn these 2 little agility terriers. They didn't really communicate at the same level with the explicitness and declarativeness, but they're both waiting very patiently right now. So I think as soon as I hang up this phone, they are going to go and ready to be running outside after these gray squirrels that have been tormenting them for the last 3 hours outside the window.
Oh, I love it.
Well, I'm a dog lover, so I want those guys to get out and have some fun. But we'll definitely get together again and do this again. But any last comments from you guys? Anything to wrap up?
I mean, I guess I'll start there. I just want to thank you both, obviously, for the role and the impact that you've had not only on myself, and I know I said this both during as well as after my Sport Movement Skill Conference back in April, but it really goes without, obviously the debt of gratitude that I have towards both of you, towards sort of representing my challenge point, not only for myself personally, I mean that from the bottom of my heart, but also for the profession as a whole. Michael, some of the stuff that you're doing with the stuff that you're putting out in social media and the way that you're constantly pushing the envelope in the things that you're doing and presenting and just being a really big spearhead towards changing the way that people think about sport movement behavior. And Korey, with what you're showing is possible with large groups and very varied groups and everything that you've done to adopt change. Both of you guys are my heroes in that regard, and I appreciate what you do for me, specifically to try and push me on this endeavor as well.
It's mutual, Shawn. Yeah, I love getting these things and be able to bounce stuff off you. And I don't have the gift of gab like you do. I'm usually a stuttering. The
blessing is a curse as well, my friend.
A stuttering fool when I talk, but seriously, for that same thing, bottom of my heart, Shawn. I love doing these things together. Love that you opened up to us 2 young coaches and being a great mentor to us. So I can't thank you enough for nights like this. Through 3 hours, just a casual 3 hours, bouncing off stuff. So I mean.
Your proposal to hop on came at the perfect time because I feel like every once in a while this needs to happen and I'll just echo we're appreciative of your mentorship. I think back to our first interaction. I just emailed you out of the blue and I thought I'll just give you just give me an hour of your time, and again there's a whole afternoon and it literally changed the course of my coaching career. And so I mean that's not an understatement. So and then your continued communication since then it's been a game changer. So we're appreciative, no doubt.
Well, the way I view it, as I said at the conference, and I know that you guys know this, we're all in it together. We're all in it to try and push the evolution, push the emergent movement, if you will, and nudge it in the direction of that for better athletic performance. And I don't think there's anybody more passionate than you guys in doing just that. So, of course, I'm always game to do exactly that, and I think that kind of speaks to the listeners that are still out there listening. Use these 2 gentlemen that I've been talking to for the last 3 hours as examples, and obviously anyone that's ever willing or desiring to reach out, I think, to any one of us. I speak for all of us there, but I think we're all open books in those ways.
Yep. Got the bracelet on. We are the movement.
I love it.
All right, guys. Hey, yep. You guys have a great rest of your Sunday. Let those dogs go out and run. Korey, go see your wife. But we'll do this again sometime shortly. So
you got it, friends.
All right,
great stuff, guys.
See ya.
Talk to you later.
Later, guys.
Join me in thanking today's guest for a wonderful episode. If you guys took something away from this episode, please share it on the social media website of your choice and thank our guests for the wonderful opportunity that we had to learn from them. And as always, we'll see you guys next time on the Elite Performance Podcast.